I'm sitting at the Christmas dinner table watching my family destroy the man I love, and I know they have no idea what's coming. My father raises his wine glass, smirking, as he announces to our 20 relatives, "Let's toast to Angela's interesting choice in men. Michael here, the poor tech nerd with no future." The table erupts in cruel laughter. My sister Isabel leans in, her voice dripping with venom. "Face it, sis, you've always been attracted to losers. At least this one matches your level." My hands tremble. My throat tightens. But when I look at Michael, expecting to see humiliation in his eyes, I see something else entirely, a calm, knowing smile. He quietly reaches for his phone. What happens in the next 60 seconds will shatter my family's world forever. Because they don't know that the poor nerd they're mocking built a $5 billion empire. They don't know about the fleet of limousines about to arrive. They don't know that the restaurant owner is about to bow and call him young master. And they definitely don't know that I'm not the struggling dispatcher they think I am. I'm a CEO who's been hiding my fortune from them for years. This is the story of how one phone call exposed 20 years of family betrayal, revealed secrets that destroyed reputations, and proved that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't violence. It's simply letting the truth walk through the door in a $1,000 suit. By the end of this night, my family will learn a lesson they'll never forget. Never underestimate the people you've spent a lifetime looking down on. Stay with me. You won't believe what happens next. My name is Angela Ramirez, and I'm 36 years old. For the past 12 years, I've built a logistics company from the ground up, though my family has no idea about any of that. To them, I'm still just the disappointing older daughter who never quite measured up. I should have known better than to hope this Christmas would be different. The moment Michael and I stepped through the doors of Marchetti's, the most expensive Italian restaurant in Phoenix, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. The hostess greeted us warmly enough, but when she checked the reservation list and said, "Ah yes, the Ramirez party, right this way," her smile shifted into something that looked almost like pity. That should have been my first warning. The private dining room glowed with soft amber lighting and flickering candles on a table set for 22. My relatives had already arrived, their voices creating that particular buzz of comfortable conversation that happens when people feel they belong. Designer dresses sparkled under the chandelier. Expensive cologne mixed with the scent of fresh flowers. My mother Maria wore pearls that caught the light. My father Carlos stood at the head of the table in a suit that probably cost more than my first car. And there was Isabel, my younger sister, radiant in a red dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her hand resting possessively on the arm of a man I'd never met before. He had that polished, aggressive confidence of someone who'd made money young and wanted everyone to know it. "Angela," my mother called out, her voice bright but hollow. "You made it. Not, 'We're so glad you're here.' Not, 'We've missed you.' Just acknowledgement that I'd successfully navigated traffic and found the restaurant. The kind of greeting you'd give an acquaintance who showed up to a party they weren't really invited to." My father nodded at me, a single curt dip of his chin, then his eyes slid past me as if I were transparent. But when his gaze landed on Michael, something flickered across his face. Assessment. Judgment. Dismissal. All in the space of 2 seconds. "This must be your husband," my father said, making the word sound like a question he already knew the disappointing answer to. "Michael," my husband said, extending his hand. "It's nice to finally meet you properly, sir." My father shook his hand with the enthusiasm of someone touching a wet dish rag, then immediately turned away. "Everyone, please find your seats. We have a wonderful evening planned." I saw our name cards then, and my stomach dropped. The very end of the table. The corner where the lighting was dimmest, where we'd be partially hidden behind a decorative pillar where we could be forgotten. Meanwhile, Isabel and her date were seated directly across from my parents in the positions of honor. As we made our way to our assigned seats, I had to pass my Aunt Rosa, my Uncle Victor cousins I hadn't seen in years. They smiled politely, but their eyes held questions. Or maybe it was worse than questions. Maybe it was conclusions they'd already drawn based on 2 decades of my family's subtle narrative. Angela, the one who never quite succeeded. Angela who'd disappointed everyone by leaving home at 18 with barely a goodbye. Angela who'd chosen a simple life over the opportunities they'd supposedly given her. "That's the older one," I heard someone whisper behind me. I couldn't see who said it, but the words carried clearly enough. "Still working in trucking, I think. Never went to college." Michael's hand found mine under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. His touch was warm, steady grounding. I glanced at him and found him looking back at me with those calm brown eyes that had first caught my attention 3 years ago at a logistics conference in Phoenix. He didn't look bothered by the seating arrangement, by the whispers, by any of it. "I'm okay," he murmured so quietly only I could hear. "Are you?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. The first course arrived, some kind of artfully arranged salad that probably cost $40 and would leave everyone hungry. Conversation flowed around us like water around stones. My cousin Jennifer talked about her daughter's acceptance to Yale. Uncle Victor bragged about his new boat. Aunt Rosa discussed her recent trip to Italy in excruciating detail. No one asked me anything. No one asked Michael anything. We might as well have been wallpaper. Then my father stood, and the room fell silent. He held his wineglass aloft, and I knew what was coming. This was his tradition, his moment to hold court and distribute his judgments disguised as holiday cheer. "My dear family," he began, his voice warm and commanding. "What a blessing it is to have everyone gathered here tonight. Christmas is about family, about celebrating our bonds and our successes together." He turned to Isabel first naturally. "My youngest daughter, Isabel, has had a remarkable year. Her marketing career continues to thrive, bringing innovation and creativity to everything she touches." He beamed at her like she'd personally cured cancer. Isabel's smile was radiant, practiced, perfect. "And this is Brad, her boyfriend, who manages investments at Morrison & Hale, a brilliant young man with a brilliant future." Brad nodded, accepting the praise like it was his due. "Thank you, sir. Isabel and I are very happy." Then my father's gaze landed on me, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "And of course, my eldest daughter, Angela, still working hard at her trucking business. Very dedicated. Very persistent." The word hung in the air like a slap. Persistent. Not successful, not accomplished, just stubbornly hanging on to something that clearly wasn't going anywhere. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Someone coughed. Brad leaned forward, then his eyes gleaming with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoys kicking people when they're down. "And this is Michael, right?" He gestured at my husband with his wineglass sloshing a little on the tablecloth. "What do you do, man? Angela mentioned you're in tech." The way he said tech made it sound like a dirty word or a lie someone tells to avoid admitting they're unemployed. Michael straightened slightly in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Yes, I work in technology, software development, and business solutions." Brad burst out laughing, a sharp, mocking bark that made several people at the table flinch. "Tech? Of course everyone and their grandmother claims they're in tech these days. That's what people say when they don't have a real job, right? When they're freelancing on Upwork or whatever." The silence that followed was excruciating. I waited for someone to defend Michael. My mother, my father, anyone. Instead, my father actually nodded as if Brad had made an excellent point. "Well," Carlos said carefully, "not everyone is cut out for traditional corporate careers. Some people prefer more flexible arrangements." The implication was crystal clear. Michael was unemployed or close enough to it that it didn't matter. A failure. A burden. Certainly not someone worthy of their daughter. I felt heat flooding my face, tears prickling behind my eyes, my hands clenched into fists under the table. But when I looked at Michael expecting to see hurt or anger or shame, I saw something else entirely. He was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed smile, but a small, knowing smile that touched the corners of his mouth and made his eyes shine with something that looked almost like amusement. "Excuse me," Michael said softly, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone. "I need to take this call." He stood, and as he walked toward the exit, I could have sworn I heard him say into the phone, "Yes, it's time. Send them all." The moment Michael disappeared through the doorway, Brad leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He swirled his wine glass like he'd just won some kind of competition. "Work call on Christmas Eve," he snorted, looking around the table for validation. "That's what people say when they're getting fired or begging for freelance gigs. Must not be a very important job if he's taking calls during family dinner." A few nervous laughs rippled around the table. My Aunt Rosa looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. Nobody ever said anything. Isabel, emboldened by Brad's performance, leaned forward with that particular gleam in her eye that I remembered from childhood, the look she got right before she'd tell Mom and Dad about something I'd done wrong. "She always picks men like that," she announced to the table, as if I weren't sitting right there. "Remember that guy she dated in high school? The one working at the gas station? Or that community college student who wanted to be a musician?" She laughed, a brittle sound that made my chest tighten. "Angela has a type. She's drawn to projects. Men who need fixing." My mother dabbed at her lips with her napkin, saying nothing. My father refilled his wine glass. The conversation shifted as naturally as water flowing around a stone. My cousin Jennifer started talking about her upcoming ski trip to Aspen. Uncle Victor mentioned something about real estate investments. Brad jumped in with opinions about the market. I sat there, frozen in my chair, feeling like I was underwater. Everything sounded muffled and distant. My hands were in my lap, twisted together so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I could feel tears building behind my eyes, that hot pressure that meant I was about 30 seconds away from completely humiliating myself by crying in front of everyone. 4 minutes passed. I counted them, watching the second hand on the antique clock mounted on the far wall. Each tick felt like an eternity. Michael still hadn't come back. What if he'd just left? What if he'd walked out the door and decided he was done with my toxic family, and by extension done with me? I wouldn't even blame him. Nobody should have to endure this kind of treatment. I was just about to stand up to excuse myself so I could go find him or break down in the bathroom or both when everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the light. Brilliant, almost blinding white light suddenly flooded through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, cutting through the warm amber glow of the dining room like a knife. Several people gasped. Brad actually shielded his eyes. "What the hell?" my cousin Jennifer muttered. I turned toward the windows and my breath caught in my throat. One black limousine pulled up outside, then another, then another. They kept coming, sleek and massive like a presidential motorcade, arranging themselves in perfect formation along the curved driveway. I counted them as they appeared: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 identical black Mercedes limousines, so polished they reflected the restaurant's lights like mirrors. "Oh my God," Isabel whispered. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Staff members abandoned their stations and rushed to the windows. Our waiter, who'd been pouring water for my Aunt Rosa, actually set the pitcher down mid-pour and hurried toward the entrance. From the kitchen I could see the manager, a thin, nervous-looking man in a black suit, emerge at a near run, his face a mixture of panic and excitement. The dining room's background music, which had been playing softly throughout our meal, suddenly cut off. Just stopped mid-note, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the murmur of confused voices. "What's happening?" my mother asked, her voice higher than normal. The limousine doors opened in perfect synchronization, and 8 men stepped out. Not regular men, security personnel. They wore black suits that fit too precisely to be off the rack, with earpieces clearly visible, and they moved with the kind of coordinated precision I'd only ever seen in movies about Secret Service agents. They fanned out immediately, scanning the perimeter, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, despite the fact that it was 7 o'clock at night. One of them spoke into his wrist. Another walked the length of the entrance, checking corners. Two more positioned themselves on either side of the center limousine, standing at attention like honor guards. Other diners in the restaurant had abandoned all pretense of eating. People were standing now, phones out, trying to record whatever was about to happen. A woman at a nearby table grabbed her husband's arm and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Is it the governor? Oh my God, is it someone famous?" Brad had jumped to his feet, craning his neck to see better. "Holy shit," he breathed. "This is incredible. Some celebrity must be eating here tonight. Maybe that actor who's filming downtown, or wait, didn't I hear the Secretary of Commerce was in Phoenix this week?" Isabel pressed her face nearly against the window, her earlier composure completely gone. "Whoever it is must be incredibly important. Look at that security detail. That's not just money, that's serious power." My father straightened in his chair, smoothing down his tie and running a hand through his hair. He had that look on his face, the one he got when he thought he might be able to impress someone or make a connection, or get his picture taken with someone notable that he could brag about later. "Well," he said, forcing a casual tone that didn't quite land, "we certainly picked the right evening to dine here. This is quite the show." "Maybe we'll get to see who it is," my mother added, patting her hair. "Rosa, do I look all right?" I couldn't speak. Something was building in my chest, something that felt like hope and terror mixed together. I watched as one of the security guards spoke into his radio, listened to a response, then nodded sharply. He walked to the center limousine and opened the rear door. Michael stepped out. Not the Michael who'd left our table 4 minutes ago with his head down and a quiet excuse. This Michael moved differently. His posture was straighter, his movements fluid and commanding. 2 security guards immediately flanked him, one on each side, maintaining exactly 3 feet of distance. 2 more followed behind their eyes, constantly scanning. And then I saw him. The restaurant owner. Not the manager who'd been rushing around, the actual owner, Giovanni Marchetti, whose picture hung in the entrance lobby next to a write-up about his legendary restaurants in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The man who supposedly only showed up for presidential dinners and celebrity weddings. Giovanni rushed forward, and in a gesture that made my heart stop, he bowed. Not a polite nod, not a handshake, but an actual deep bow, the kind of formal gesture of respect I'd only ever seen in historical movies. "Young Master Rivera." Giovanni's voice carried clearly through the silent restaurant, his Italian accent thick with reverence. "It is an extraordinary honor to have you with us this evening. We are entirely at your service." Michael inclined his head slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal. He said something too quiet for me to hear, and Giovanni nodded frantically, gesturing toward the entrance. Then Michael began walking toward the restaurant, and it was like watching the Red Sea part. Security moved ahead of him, and every single person, staff, diners, everyone stepped back instinctively. The background music didn't start again. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He walked through the entrance, past the host stand, past the bar where a bartender stood frozen with a cocktail shaker in mid-air. He walked into our private dining room, and every eye followed him. He walked straight to our table. My father's mouth had fallen open. Brad had gone pale, his earlier smugness completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked like fear. Isabel stared at me with wide eyes, her expression a mixture of shock and something that might have been betrayal, as if I'd deliberately kept some enormous secret from her. The entire room had fallen into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Michael stopped beside my chair, and when he looked down at me, his eyes held the same warmth they always did, the same love, but now there was something else there too. Something that looked like vindication. "Sorry about that, sweetheart," he said softly, and his voice in that silence sounded like thunder. "Shall we continue our dinner?" As I sat there in that crushing silence, watching my family's faces transform from smugness to confusion, to something approaching fear, a flood of memories washed over me. It was as if the shocked stillness in the restaurant had cracked open a door I'd kept carefully locked for 18 years. I was 8 years old again, standing in our kitchen on my birthday morning. My mother had set a single cupcake on the counter, the kind that comes in a plastic container from the grocery store bakery with too sweet frosting and a wilted paper decoration stuck in the top. "Happy birthday, Angela," she'd said absently, already moving on to other things. That afternoon, I'd sat alone at the kitchen table with that cupcake and a glass of milk singing "Happy Birthday" to myself in a whisper so quiet nobody could hear. 2 weeks later, Isabel turned 4. My parents rented out the community center. They hired a magician who pulled raboons out of hats and made balloon animals. 30 children ran around in a chaos of laughter and cake and presents stacked so high they nearly touched the ceiling. I'd helped set up the decorations that morning, hanging streamers while my mother directed me. "Higher, Angela." "No, that's crooked. Can't you do anything right?" When I asked my father that evening why my birthday had been so different, he'd looked at me with something between irritation and pity. "Your sister is younger, mija. She needs these special memories. You're a big girl now. You understand, right?" I'd nodded because that's what you do when you're 8 and you want your parents to love you. You nod and pretend it doesn't hurt. The pattern continued relentless as a tide wearing down stone. When I was 12, I spent 3 months building a working model of the solar system for the school science fair, staying up late every night, painting papier-mâché planets and wiring tiny LED lights. I won first place. The ribbon was blue and gold and beautiful, and when the principal handed it to me, I imagined my parents in the audience proud, maybe even surprised by what their older daughter could accomplish. But when I scanned the crowd of parents with their cameras and their smiles, I found only empty seats where mine should have been. Later, I learned they'd taken Isabel shopping for new school clothes. "It couldn't wait," my mother explained over dinner that night, not quite meeting my eyes. "The sale was ending. You know how expensive things are. We have to take advantage when we can." My father had looked at my blue ribbon with mild interest, the way you might look at a piece of junk mail before throwing it away. "That's nice, Angela. Very nice." Then he turned to Isabel. "Tell me about the dress we got you, princesa." By 16, I'd learned not to ask for anything. When the school supply list came out each August, I knew better than to bring it to my parents. Instead, I worked after-school shifts at a local diner, smelling like grease and coffee, counting my tips, and saving every dollar. I bought my own textbooks, used ones with other students' notes in the margins, and cracked spines. But they were mine. I'd earned them. Meanwhile, Isabel got everything brand new. Textbooks with pristine covers. A backpack that cost more than my entire week's wages. New clothes for every season. "You're older," my mother said when I once made the mistake of pointing out the inequality. "You need to learn to be independent. We're teaching you responsibility. Someday you'll thank us." But the wound that never healed, the memory that still woke me up sometimes in the middle of the night, was graduation day. I was 17, and I'd worked myself to exhaustion to become valedictorian. It wasn't about being smart, though I was. It was about proving something. Proving I mattered. Proving I existed. I'd written my speech over dozens of drafts, polishing every word until it shone. I practiced in front of my bedroom mirror until I could recite it without the paper shaking in my hands. The morning of graduation, I'd asked one more time, "You'll be there, right? Both of you." My mother had smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart. We wouldn't miss it." Standing at that podium in my cap and gown, giving my speech to 300 people about perseverance and believing in yourself, I looked out into the audience and found their seats empty. Just empty. 2 vacant chairs in a sea of proud parents with cameras and flowers. I got through the speech. I don't know how. My voice only cracked once, and I don't think anyone noticed. Afterward, I asked a friend's mother where my parents were. She looked uncomfortable and said she'd seen them leaving earlier. Some kind of family emergency, I think. There was no emergency. When I got home that evening, still wearing my graduation gown because nobody had been there to take pictures, I found my parents sitting at the dinner table with Isabel looking at a program from her middle school recital. It had been at the same time as my graduation. They'd chosen her dance recital, where she'd been part of an ensemble barely visible in the back row over my valedictorian speech. I called them from my bedroom, my voice breaking. "How could you miss it? How could you not come?" My mother's voice was sharp with annoyance, as if I were being unreasonable. "We had to go with your sister Angela. She's younger and she needed our support. You're basically an adult now. You'll understand when you have children of your own." Then she hung up. Just click and silence. That night, sitting on my bed with my graduation gown puddled around me like a deflated dream, I made a promise to myself I would leave the moment I turned 18. I would build a life where I didn't need them, where their approval meant nothing, where I would never again feel the particular pain of being invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most. And I kept that promise. But what they never understood, what they still couldn't comprehend even now, as they sat in this restaurant staring at Michael like he'd descended from another planet, was what that neglect had forged in me. They thought they'd broken me. They thought I was the weak one, the failure, the daughter who couldn't measure up. They never knew who I became after I left that house. The day I turned 18, I packed everything I owned into a single battered suitcase. It didn't take long. I had 3 pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, 2 sweaters, a winter coat with a broken zipper, and a few personal items that mattered only to me: my blue ribbon from the science fair, my valedictorian certificate, and a photograph of my grandmother who'd passed away when I was 10. She was the only person in my family who'd ever looked at me like I was worth something. My Aunt Carmen, my mother's sister who'd always been kind to me in quiet ways that went unnoticed by the rest of the family, had slipped me $300 in an envelope the week before. "For your new start," she'd written on a card tucked inside. "You're stronger than they know." I cried when I read it, sitting alone in my childhood bedroom for the last time. I left before dawn, before anyone else woke up. I didn't leave a note. I figured if they cared enough to wonder where I'd gone, they'd call. They didn't call. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until years later, was that I should have been starting college that fall. I should have been packing for a dorm room at Stanford, excited and nervous about my future. I'd applied for a full-ride scholarship in my senior year, one specifically designed for first-generation college students with exceptional academic records. I'd poured my heart into that application, written essays about overcoming adversity and building resilience. But when decision time came, my parents told me the scholarship had fallen through. "These things happen," my father had said with a shrug. "Maybe college isn't for everyone anyway. You could get a job, start earning money." So that's what I did, because I didn't know any better. I didn't know they'd intercepted the acceptance letter. I didn't know they'd given that scholarship to Isabel, instead forging documents to make it work. I didn't know that my entire future had been stolen and handed to my sister like it was nothing more than a Christmas present being redistributed. I found work at a small trucking company on the outskirts of Phoenix. Martinez Transport had seen better days. The paint on their 3 trucks was faded, the office smelled like old coffee and diesel fuel, and the pay was minimum wage. But the owner, a man named Roberto Martinez, who was 73 and should have retired a decade earlier, looked at my application and saw something nobody else had seen in a long time. He saw potential. "You're overqualified for a dispatcher job," he said, tapping my high school transcript. "Valedictorian. Perfect attendance. Why aren't you in college?" I couldn't tell him the truth because I didn't know it yet, so I made something up about needing to work about family circumstances. He nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. "Well," he said, "if you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach you everything I know about this business." And he did. Roberto became the father figure I'd never had. He taught me how to read delivery routes like maps to hidden treasure, how to talk to difficult clients, how to negotiate rates without undercutting our own value. He showed me the margins, the overhead cost, the delicate balance between keeping trucks on the road and keeping the business solvent. I worked the night shift because it paid 50 cents more per hour and I needed every penny. During my breaks, I took online courses in supply chain management and business administration, paying for them one class at a time with money I should have spent on better food or a warmer apartment. I worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when drivers called in sick. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. I learned to make a dollar stretch until it screamed. I learned that the only person I could truly depend on was myself. 3 years into my job at Martinez Transport, Roberto called me into his office with tears in his eyes. The company was going bankrupt. Medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment had drained his savings, and he couldn't keep up with the truck payments. "I'm going to have to let you go, mija," he said, and the pain in his voice was real. "I'm so sorry. You deserved better than this." I asked him how much he owed. When he told me, I did something that probably looked crazy to anyone watching. I went to every bank in Phoenix asking for a business loan. I was 21 years old with barely any credit history, asking to borrow enough money to buy a failing trucking company. 16 banks said no. The 17th said yes, though I didn't understand until much later why my credit score was so mysteriously low for someone who'd never had a credit card. I bought Martinez Transport. Roberto cried when I handed him the check and told him he could stay on as a consultant for as long as he wanted. He worked with me for 5 more years before his own health declined, and those were the years I learned the most important lessons of all. The next 10 years were a blur of 18-hour days and sacrifices I never regretted. From that small office with 3 aging trucks, I built Ramirez Logistics into something Roberto would have been proud of. I reinvested every dollar of profit back into the business. I bought more trucks, hired more drivers, expanded our routes beyond Phoenix into Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, California, Utah. I learned that success wasn't just about profit margins, it was about building something that mattered. I paid my drivers well above industry standard because I remembered what it felt like to choose between gas money and groceries. I offered health insurance and retirement benefits because I knew what medical bills had done to Roberto's family. I created flexible schedules for single parents who needed to pick their kids up from school because I knew what it felt like to be invisible to the people who should have cared most. By the time I was 36, Ramirez Logistics operated a fleet of over 200 vehicles with 400 employees across 6 states. Our annual revenue hit $25 million. My personal net worth was somewhere around $8 million, though I rarely thought about it in those terms. The money was never the point. The point was proving to myself that I existed, that I mattered, that the girl who'd been invisible her entire childhood could build something real and solid and undeniable. But here's the thing, nobody understood the irony that made me smile sometimes in the dark. I succeeded because they underestimated me, because nobody was watching, nobody was waiting for me to fail, nobody was judging every move I made. I was free to build my empire in silence, invisible in the best possible way. I never told my family. At our rare encounters, weddings, funerals, the occasional obligatory holiday, they asked what I was doing and I said simply, "Still in trucking." They heard what they wanted to hear, that I was still that dispatcher, still struggling, still the disappointing daughter who'd never amount to anything. And I let them believe it because I knew the truth. If they discovered my success, they would come back. Not out of pride or love or genuine interest in my life, but because they would want something. Money, probably, or bragging rights, or the chance to rewrite history and pretend they'd supported me all along. I'd learned the hardest lesson life had to teach. I didn't need approval from people who'd never deserved the right to give it. Until a man walked into my life who truly saw my worth. 3 years before that Christmas dinner, I attended a conference in downtown Phoenix called Women in Logistics. I normally avoided these kinds of events, too much networking, too many people trying to sell me things, too many uncomfortable conversations where someone would inevitably ask about my background, and I'd have to decide how much truth to tell. But this conference featured a speaker I respected, a woman who'd built a nationwide freight company from a single truck, and I wanted to hear her story. During the lunch break on the first day, I escaped to a quiet corner of the hotel's break room with a sandwich and my phone, checking emails and trying to look busy enough that nobody would try to make small talk. That's when I noticed him. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair and the kind of quiet presence that made you look twice. What struck me immediately was how differently he dressed compared to everyone else in the room. The conference was full of logistics, CEOs and executives in expensive suits. Designer watches glinting under the fluorescent lights, everything carefully calculated to broadcast success and importance. This man wore dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and sneakers that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. He looked like someone who'd wandered in from a college campus, not a business conference. He caught me looking and smiled, walking over with a confidence that didn't match his casual appearance. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Go ahead," I said, expecting him to launch into the usual conference small talk about companies and contracts. Instead, he extended his hand. "Michael, I work in tech." "Angela," I replied. "Logistics." We started talking about supply chain automation, a topic that had been covered in the morning sessions. But as we talked, I noticed something odd. Michael asked incredibly specific questions about my business model, about challenges I faced with route optimization, about how I balanced efficiency with driver satisfaction. These weren't general questions someone asks to make polite conversation. These were questions that suggested he'd done research, that he knew exactly what issues small to medium logistics companies dealt with. "You know a lot about this industry for someone in tech." I observed, studying his face. His smile was warm but mysterious. "I like learning about inspiring people," he said. The word choice struck me as unusual, not inspiring companies or successful businesses. People, singular, specific. Over the next 3 days of the conference, I kept running into Michael. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Phoenix is a big city, but conference venues create small worlds where the same people cycle through the same spaces. But the encounters felt deliberate somehow. He was always in the hallway when I stepped out of a session. He appeared at the coffee station exactly when I needed a caffeine break. He sat 2 rows behind me during presentations, and I could feel his attention focused on me rather than the speaker. Most people would have found it creepy. Somehow it wasn't. Maybe because he never pushed, never invaded my space, never made me feel uncomfortable. He was just there, present, attentive in a way I'd never experienced before. On the second day, during an afternoon break, we found ourselves in the hotel courtyard. The Arizona sun was warm despite it being February, and I'd escaped outside to clear my head after a particularly dense seminar on federal transportation regulations. Michael appeared a few minutes later carrying 2 bottles of water. He offered me one without asking if I wanted it, and somehow he'd chosen exactly the brand I preferred. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said after we'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. I tensed, expecting the usual invasive questions about my age or my marital status, or why I didn't have children yet. "Does your family support your work?" he asked instead. The question hit me like a physical blow. Nobody had ever asked me that. Nobody. In all my years of building my company, attending industry events, talking with other business owners, not a single person had thought to ask whether the people who should have loved me actually believed in what I was doing. I could have lied. I could have given him the polite, sanitized version, "Oh, they're proud in their own way." But something about Michael's steady gaze, about the genuine curiosity in his eyes, made me tell the truth. "No," I said quietly. "They never believed I could succeed at anything. They still think I'm a dispatcher earning minimum wage. They think I'm the failure of the family." I expected judgment or pity. Instead, Michael nodded slowly, his expression shifting into something that looked like recognition. Like he'd found something he'd been searching for. "My family was the same," he said, his voice soft but certain. "They only saw me as a tool to use, a means to an end. Everything I achieved was supposed to serve their purposes, never my own. When I finally left, they acted like I'd betrayed them by wanting to exist as my own person." Something unlocked in my chest. For the first time in my life, I was talking to someone who understood. Not someone who offered sympathy from a distance, but someone who'd lived in the same emotional prison I'd escaped from. We talked for hours that afternoon, missing 2 entire conference sessions. We talked about growing up feeling invisible or over-controlled. We talked about family members who confused love with possession, who couldn't see their children as separate human beings with their own dreams and worth. We talked about the particular kind of loneliness that comes from succeeding, despite your family, rather than because of them, about the hollow victory of proving yourself to people who refuse to see the proof. When the conference ended, Michael asked for my number. 6 months later, we got married. It wasn't a romantic proposal with roses and a bended knee. It was a conversation over breakfast on a Tuesday morning, both of us sitting at his kitchen table in comfortable silence before starting our workdays. "I want to spend my life with you," he said simply. "Not because you're successful or impressive, though you're both, but because you're the first person who's ever made me feel like I'm enough exactly as I am. Will you marry me?" We went to the courthouse the following week. Just us and 2 witnesses. We pulled from the courthouse hallway a paralegal and a law student who were happy to help for $20 each. No white dress, no flowers, no ceremony, just vows and signatures and a kiss that felt like coming home. I didn't invite my family because I knew exactly what would happen. My mother would criticize my dress. My father would make comments about how small and pathetic the ceremony was. Isabel would find ways to make it about herself. They would take what should have been a beautiful moment and poison it with their judgment. "I want you as my wife," Michael said, when I explained why I wasn't inviting them, not a performance for an audience. "This is about us. Nobody else matters." It was the perfect answer. It was the only answer. For the next 2.5 years, we built a quiet life together. Michael worked from home, spending long hours on his laptop in the small office of our modest townhouse. I assumed he was a freelance software engineer, probably doing contract work for various tech companies. He never talked much about his job, and I never pressed. Money wasn't tight. We both contributed to household expenses easily enough, but we lived simply. We shopped at regular grocery stores, wore normal clothes, drove reliable but unremarkable cars. I loved him for who he was, thoughtful, kind, brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with money or status. He made me coffee every morning exactly the way I liked it. He listened when I talked about difficult days at work. He never once made me feel like I had to be anything other than exactly who I was. I thought I knew everything about him that mattered, because Michael was far more than the poor nerd my family believed. What I haven't told you yet, what I need you to understand to make sense of what happened at that Christmas dinner, is the truth about the man I married. Michael had shared pieces of his past with me slowly over our years together, the way you reveal scars to someone you trust not to flinch away. Late-night conversations in our bedroom. Quiet confessions over morning coffee. The kind of vulnerable honesty that only comes when 2 people recognize matching wounds in each other. Michael Rivera wasn't a freelance software engineer struggling for contracts. He was the founder and majority shareholder of RivTech Solutions, an artificial intelligence and logistics software company valued at $5 billion. $5 billion. His clients included Amazon, FedEx, DHL, and virtually every major shipping company in North America. His algorithms optimized supply chains for half the Fortune 500 companies. His technology was quietly revolutionizing an entire industry. But if you searched for Michael Rivera on Forbes or TechCrunch or any business publication, you'd find nothing. No profile pictures, no interviews, no features about brilliant young tech moguls. Michael had deliberately structured his company through a maze of holding companies, trusts, and legal entities specifically designed to keep his name out of public records. Most people in the industry knew RivTech Solutions. Almost nobody knew who actually owned it. He'd explained why one night about 6 months into our marriage, when I'd noticed him on a video call speaking with the kind of authority that didn't match my mental image of a freelance contractor. After the call ended, he'd sat me down and told me everything. The Rivera family was a Cuban-American dynasty in Miami, old money, mixed with new, the kind of wealth that came with expectations and obligations, and chains wrapped in silk. Michael's grandfather had fled Cuba in the 60s with nothing and built a commercial real estate empire. His father had expanded into banking and investments. By the time Michael was born, the Riveras were one of the most powerful families in South Florida, the kind of people who had senators on speed dial and named hospital wings after themselves. They'd raised Michael like a prize thoroughbred being groomed for a race. Every choice in his life was made for him, or rather made for the family's benefit, with his compliance assumed. His schools were chosen to maximize networking opportunities. His major was predetermined business naturally with a focus on finance. His social circle was carefully curated from other wealthy families, potential merger opportunities, walking around in designer clothes. When he turned 23, his family began arranging dates with daughters of business associates, treating marriage like a corporate acquisition. Merge empires, they called it, as if Michael's feelings or desires were irrelevant details that would work themselves out. As if he were a chess piece rather than a person. "They never saw me," Michael had said, his voice quiet but hard. "They saw the Rivera name, the family legacy, the business opportunities I represented. When I tried to start my own projects, my father shut them down if they didn't serve the family's interests. When I suggested I might want to live somewhere other than Miami, my mother acted like I'd suggested committing treason. Everything I did, it all had to serve them. I was a tool. A very expensive, well-educated tool." At 27, Michael did something his family never imagined he'd have the courage to do. He'd been quietly building Rivtech on the side using a different name, keeping it completely separate from the Rivera business empire. When the company started gaining traction, when venture capitalists came calling, he made his move. He'd consulted with lawyers who confirmed he was legally entitled to his trust fund money his grandfather had specifically set aside for him, not for the family business. He transferred those funds to accounts his family couldn't access. Then he took the seed money and invested it all into Rivtech under a corporate structure so complex it would take forensic accountants months to trace back to him. And then he disappeared. He changed his appearance, let his hair grow longer, started dressing in jeans and casual clothes instead of the tailored suits his mother had always insisted upon. He moved to Phoenix, about as far from Miami's social scene as you could get while staying in the continental United States. He built his company from the ground up, proving every single day that his success had nothing to do with the Rivera name and everything to do with his own brilliant mind. For 8 years, he maintained zero contact with his family. They'd tried to find him at first, he said. Hired investigators made calls, pulled strings with their political connections. But Michael had been thorough. Legal name changes, addresses hidden behind corporate entities, a life lived deliberately under the radar. Eventually, they'd stopped looking, or at least stopped looking hard enough to find him. "I was lonely, though," he'd admitted, taking my hand. Success is hollow when you're proving yourself to people who refuse to see the proof. When I built something incredible, there was nobody to share it with. Nobody who understood what it cost to get there. That's when he told me about the conference, about how meeting me hadn't been entirely coincidental. Rivtech had been exploring partnerships with mid-size logistics companies, firms, small enough to be agile but large enough to handle significant volume. His research team had compiled a short list of potential partners based on growth trajectories, ethical business practices, and operational efficiency. Ramirez Logistics had ranked in the top 3. Michael had read my company's profile, the case study his analysts had prepared. From dispatcher to CEO in 12 years. No family money, no investors, just smart decisions and relentless work. Fair wages for drivers, low turnover rates, steady growth without cutting corners. Everything in that report had impressed him from a business standpoint. But what made him decide to attend the conference personally to arrange those coincidental meetings was the personal narrative his team had uncovered. About a woman who'd built success while being completely unsupported by her family, who'd created something meaningful out of nothing but determination and intelligence. I wanted to see if the person matched the profile he'd said. I thought maybe we could do business together. But when I met you, when we started talking, I realized I'd found something so much more important than a business partnership. I found someone who understood. Someone who'd fought the same battles I had. Someone who knew what it meant to succeed anyway. His feelings for me were real, completely genuine. He'd made that clear over and over. But yes, our meeting had been engineered, at least initially. He'd sought me out deliberately, researched me, positioned himself in my path. I should have been angry when he told me. I should have felt manipulated or deceived. But I understood. Because in his position, having escaped one controlling family, of course he'd be careful. Of course he'd want to know who he was getting involved with before opening his heart. And in the end, he'd chosen me for exactly who I was, scars, history, and all. Now sitting at that Christmas dinner, watching my family's faces drain of color as they realized the poor nerd they'd mocked was actually Michael Rivera, I understood something else. Michael had built his entire adult life around staying invisible, avoiding recognition, keeping his success private. He valued his anonymity more than almost anything. But my family was about to awaken the side of Michael they should have feared. What I didn't know at the time, what I wouldn't piece together until much later when all the secrets came tumbling out, was that the Christmas dinner had been a trap from the very beginning. 3 weeks before that evening at Marchetti's, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, Isabel's voice came through with a sweetness I hadn't heard in years, maybe decades. "Angela, hi, I'm so glad I caught you." My first instinct was suspicion. Isabel never called me. We saw each other maybe once a year at obligatory family events, exchanged awkward small talk, and went our separate ways. Phone calls suggesting we actually had a relationship that wasn't us. "Mom and Dad want to do a traditional family Christmas dinner this year." She continued, her voice bright and eager. "You know, like we used to when we were kids. They really want you to come. They miss you so much." The words felt wrong in my mouth, like biting into fruit that looked perfect, but tasted rotten. My parents missed me. The same parents who'd skipped my high school graduation, who'd never once visited my office or asked about my company beyond dismissive one-line questions. But that treacherous part of me, the part that never quite healed from childhood, whispered, "Maybe this time is different. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they finally want to know me." "You and Michael both have to come," Isabel pressed. "It'll be at Marchetti's. Really nice, classy, a proper family celebration." I agreed, though every instinct told me not to. Michael had looked at me with concern when I told him about the invitation. "Are you sure?" he'd asked. "After everything you've told me about them. Maybe it'll be different this time," I'd said. And even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. What I didn't know was that the moment Isabel hung up with me, she'd turned to Brad with a satisfied grin. I learned about this months later, piecing together the story from fragments and confessions and things people let slip when they thought I wasn't listening. "Done," she'd told him. "Now we just need to set the stage." Brad, I would discover, was exactly the kind of man Isabel would be attracted to. 34 years old, working at Morrison & Hale, a second-tier hedge fund that tried hard to look like it played in the big leagues. He had that aggressive confidence that came from making money young and wanting everyone to know it. Designer suits, expensive watch, the kind of polished appearance that was all surface and no substance. What Isabel didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until it was too late, was that Brad didn't love her. He'd targeted her deliberately after hearing her brag at a networking event about her family wealth and successful family business. Brad was drowning in debt from gambling and a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. He saw Isabel as his ticket to financial stability, marry into money, he'd told himself. Problem solved. When Isabel told him about the Christmas dinner plan, Brad had been enthusiastic for all the wrong reasons. "If we humiliate your sister enough," he'd suggested, "you'll become the golden child again. And then your parents will support us financially, maybe help with a down payment on that condo you want." What neither of them knew, what I certainly didn't know, was the deeper connection threading through this whole mess. Brad's gambling debts hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He'd borrowed money from people who made their living off desperate men who thought the next hand, the next bet, the next game would finally be the one that solved everything. One of those people had connections to the same gambling ring my father had been borrowing from for 20 years. My father, Carlos Ramirez, the man who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of looking successful while drowning in debt, who'd learned to smile and toast and play the role of proud patriarch while secretly selling off assets, taking out hidden loans, gambling away money that was supposed to pay for his daughter's futures. I noticed things that evening that didn't make sense at the time. The way my father kept checking his phone anxiously, his jaw tight. The forced quality of his cheerfulness, like an actor playing a role he'd rehearsed too many times. The strategic seating arrangement that placed Michael and me in the shadows while Isabel and Brad basked in the spotlight. I thought it was just typical favoritism. I didn't realize it was a carefully constructed stage for a performance designed to break me down emotionally, so my father could swoop in afterward with an offer of reconciliation, one that would require me to sign over partial ownership of my company as proof of my commitment to family. This wasn't new for him. I would learn later, much later, about the other times he'd used emotional manipulation to extract money from people. Small business loans he'd convinced friends to give him. Investment opportunities he'd sold to relatives that somehow never materialized. A pattern of using people's love and trust as currency to feed an addiction that had been destroying him from the inside for longer than I'd been alive. Carlos had planned his toasts carefully, each word designed to praise Isabel while diminishing me. Each comparison meant to make me feel small, inadequate, desperate for approval. Then, after the dinner when I was emotionally raw, he would take me aside, offer to help, suggest that maybe if I let the family invest in my business, we could all benefit. We could finally be a real family again. All I had to do was trust him. It was the same pattern he'd used on my mother for decades, the same manipulation he'd tried on relatives and friends. Break them down, then offer salvation with strings attached. But what none of them understood, what they couldn't have predicted, was that they were playing a game they'd already lost. Because the moment they decided to humiliate Michael, the moment they chose to use him as a prop in their little drama, they'd awakened something they should have feared. They thought they controlled the room, controlled the narrative, controlled the evening's outcome. They had no idea what was about to walk through the door. The appetizers arrived on pristine white plates, each one arranged like a small work of art. Seared scallops with microgreens. Carpaccio so thin you could see the plate beneath it. Food that cost more than some people's weekly grocery bills. I pushed mine around with my fork, my stomach too tight to eat. That's when my father stood up his champagne glass, catching the light from the chandelier above. The table fell silent with practiced ease. This was his moment, the performance he'd been preparing for, and everyone knew their role was to watch and applaud. My dear family and friends. He began, his voice warm and expansive, the voice of a man who believed himself generous and wise. Today is a special day. We're all gathered here, reunited, celebrating the bonds that hold us together through everything life throws our way. He turned first to Isabel naturally, always to Isabel first. His face softened with genuine pride, or at least a convincing imitation of it. My youngest daughter. My Isabel. What a year she's had. He placed his free hand on her shoulder like a blessing. A marketing star who just closed a major deal that's going to revolutionize her company's entire brand strategy, bringing innovation and creativity to everything she touches. Isabel beamed her smile radiant and practiced. I knew that smile. She'd perfected it in mirrors since she was 12 years old. The smile that said, I deserve this attention, this praise, this spotlight. The deal he was talking about, I would later learn, was a $50,000 social media campaign for a local restaurant chain. Respectable work certainly, but hardly revolutionary. In my world, that would barely cover the cost of maintaining my fleet for a month, but my father spoke about it like she'd personally negotiated peace in the Middle East. And this is Brad. My father continued, gesturing to the man sitting beside Isabel like he was presenting a prize at a show. Her boyfriend who manages millions in investments at Morrison and Hale. A brilliant young man with a brilliant future ahead of him. We're so lucky to have him joining our family. Brad nodded, accepting the praise like it was oxygen he needed to breathe. Thank you, sir, he said, his voice smooth and confident. Isabel and I are very happy together. Very happy. I watched this performance from my corner table, feeling like a ghost at my own family's gathering. The praise went on. Cousins were acknowledged for their accomplishments, real or exaggerated. Aunts and uncles were thanked for their presence. The entire table glowed with the warmth of my father's approval. Then his eyes landed on me. The warmth didn't exactly disappear, but it shifted into something else. Something that looked like sympathy, but felt like contempt. "And of course," he said, his smile tightening just slightly, "my eldest daughter, Angela." He paused as if searching for something positive to say and coming up empty. "Still working hard at her trucking business." The word trucking came out like he was describing someone who collected garbage. Very dedicated, very persistent. That's honest work too, you know. Nothing wrong with honest work. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away, studying their plates with sudden fascination. Someone coughed. The condescension in his tone was so thick I could feel it coating my skin like oil. That's when Brad leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoys watching others squirm. He'd had just enough wine to feel bold, to feel invincible. "Angela," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire table, "what exactly do you do? Like specifically, do you drive the trucks yourself?" The question was designed to humiliate. Everyone at the table knew it. I met his eyes, refusing to look away. "I manage logistics operations," I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. Brad threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that made several people flinch. "Oh, wow. Fancy word for dispatcher, right? That's what we're calling it now." He looked around the table, inviting everyone to join his mockery. A few people smiled uncomfortably. My father said nothing, did nothing, just watched with that same tight smile. Isabel couldn't resist joining in. She never could resist an opportunity to remind everyone of our respective places in the family hierarchy. "My sister always chooses such humble paths in life," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It's very admirable, actually. Very grounded." Then she turned her attention to Michael, and I felt my chest constrict. "And your husband?" She looked at him like he was something unpleasant she'd discovered on the bottom of her shoe. "Michael, remind me, what was it you do? You're in tech, right? Which startup?" Michael looked up from his barely touched appetizer. His face was calm, almost serene. "I develop software solutions," he said simply. No elaboration, no defense, just a statement of fact. Brad pounced on that like a predator spotting wounded prey. "Oh my God," he said, laughing even harder now. "Everyone develops software nowadays. That's like the default answer when you don't have a real job." He took a long drink of his wine, emboldened by the lack of pushback from the table. "Seriously though, do you have funding, venture capital? Or wait, let me guess. Bootstrapped. Working out of a coffee shop with a laptop." The mockery in his voice was thick enough to choke on. Michael didn't respond, just looked at Brad with that same calm expression that was starting to unnerve me. It wasn't embarrassment or shame. It was something else entirely. Brad kept going, riding the wave of his own cruelty. "See, this is what bothers me about tech bros nowadays. If you're struggling, just say you're struggling. If you're unemployed, own it. Don't hide behind these buzzwords and pretend you're building something important. Software solutions." He said it in a mocking voice. What does that even mean? I looked around the table, desperately searching for someone, anyone who would defend us, who would tell Brad to shut up, who would acknowledge that this had gone way too far. My mother studied her wine glass. My father refilled his own glass with careful attention to not spilling a drop. Isabel smirked. My cousins looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Aunt Rosa opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again. Nobody defended us. Not a single person. I looked at Michael, then silently begging him with my eyes to say something to defend himself, to reveal even a fraction of the truth that would shut Brad's mouth forever. But Michael just smiled, that strange, knowing smile I'd seen earlier. Not sad, not embarrassed. Something else, amused. He looked amused. Brad saw it too, and it seemed to infuriate him. "There he goes. Brad announced to the table, his voice dripping with scorn as Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Work call on Christmas Eve. Let me guess, checking Upwork for new gigs, seeing if anyone needs a website built, maybe updating your LinkedIn profile." The table erupted in laughter. Not everyone. Some people looked genuinely uncomfortable now, but enough. Enough that the sound felt like waves crashing over my head, drowning me. I felt blood rushing to my face, pounding in my ears. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. This was systematic destruction, and my family was participating in it like it was entertainment. But I wasn't crying for myself. I was watching the man I loved, the kindest and most brilliant person I'd ever known, being treated like he was worthless, being mocked and degraded by people who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as him. And then Michael stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a fluid grace that suddenly seemed to fill the entire room. He slipped his phone into his pocket, and when he moved, there was something in his posture that made me catch my breath. Power. Authority. The kind of presence that couldn't be faked or learned, only earned. He looked like a king rising from a throne disguised as a simple chair, like someone who'd been playing a role and had just decided the performance was over. And then Michael rose from his seat without a word. Michael walked toward the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, moving with that same quiet grace that had first attracted me to him. I watched him disappear through the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest, wondering if he was simply going to leave, if I'd finally pushed him too far by bringing him into this toxic environment. Brad's voice cut through my thoughts. "There he goes," he announced loudly, making sure everyone at the table could hear. "Bet he's calling Mommy for money, or maybe his boss begging them not to fire him for taking a personal call during dinner." He paused for effect, then delivered his punchline. "Oh wait, he doesn't have a boss because he doesn't have a real job." The laughter that followed felt like knives. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. I was done. Done with this dinner. Done with these people. Done pretending I needed their approval. "Excuse me," I said to no one in particular, reaching for my purse. But then everything changed. It started subtly, the kind of shift you feel in your bones before you understand what you're sensing. The waiter who'd been pouring water at the next table suddenly stopped mid-pour and looked toward the entrance. Then another staff member hurried past our table, moving faster than restaurant decorum typically allowed. Then another. Brad was still talking, still riding high on his own cruelty. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching 4 men in black suits materialize near the restaurant's entrance. Not regular suits, these were the kind that cost thousands of dollars and fit like they'd been sewn directly onto their bodies. Each man wore an earpiece, and they moved with synchronized precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. One of them spoke quietly into his wrist. "Perimeter check complete, awaiting arrival." The restaurant owner himself emerged from the kitchen. I recognized Giovanni Marchetti from the photograph that hung in the entrance lobby, the legendary restaurateur whose empire stretched from New York to Los Angeles. His face was flushed with excitement and what looked like nervousness. He grabbed the manager by the arm and whispered something urgent. The manager's eyes went wide. Suddenly, the entire staff went into motion. Servers abandoned their tables mid-service. The hostess left her podium. They began clearing the center aisle of the dining room, moving chairs, repositioning a decorative plant, creating a pathway from the entrance to the back of the restaurant where we sat. The background music that had been playing softly all evening, some instrumental jazz that was meant to be elegant and unobtrusive, cut off mid-note. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own breathing. "What's happening?" my mother asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. Other diners had noticed too. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks were set down. People turned in their chairs, craning their necks to see what was causing the commotion. Brad jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over his wine glass in his eagerness. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Someone important must be coming. Like really important." His face lit up with the kind of excitement that came from thinking he might get to rub shoulders with fame or power. "I bet it's that actor who's been filming downtown. Or maybe a politician. Didn't someone say the Secretary of Commerce was in Phoenix?" Isabel pressed her face nearly against the window, her earlier composure completely abandoned. "Look at that security detail," she whispered. "This isn't just money. This is serious power." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw them arriving. 5 black limousines, Mercedes S-Class, the latest models with tinted windows so dark they looked like rolling shadows. They pulled up in perfect military formation, spacing themselves with geometric precision along the curved driveway. Their headlights created a wall of brilliant white light that flooded through the windows and transformed the warm amber lighting of the restaurant into something harsh and exposing. The doors opened simultaneously like a choreographed performance. 8 security personnel stepped out, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency I'd only seen in movies about presidential motorcades. They fanned out immediately, scanning the perimeter, their hands resting casually near their waistbands in a gesture that suggested they were armed and trained to use those weapons. One of them, the one who seemed to be in charge, touched his earpiece and spoke, "Location secure. Ready for young master." Young master. The words hung in the air like a revelation I wasn't ready to process. People in the restaurant were standing now, abandoning all pretense of dining. Phones came out, held up to record whatever was about to happen. The woman at the table next to ours grabbed her husband's arm and said in a voice loud enough for me to hear, "Oh my God, is it royalty, foreign dignitary? This is incredible!" Carlos had straightened in his chair, smoothing down his tie and running a hand through his hair with the desperate vanity of someone who thought he might get his picture taken with someone famous. "Well," he said, forcing a casual tone that didn't quite work, "we certainly picked an eventful evening to dine here. What timing?" Maria was patting her hair, checking her reflection in a knife blade. "Do I look all right, Rosa? Do I look all right?" The center limousine's door opened. Michael stepped out and I literally stopped breathing. This wasn't the Michael I knew, the man who wore jeans and comfortable sweaters, who made me coffee in our small kitchen, who worked quietly from home and never drew attention to himself. This Michael moved like liquid power, each gesture economical and commanding. 2 security guards immediately flanked him, maintaining exactly 3 feet of distance on either side. 2 more followed 3 paces behind. And then Giovanni Marchetti, the man whose restaurants had hosted presidents and celebrities, whose approval was so legendary that getting a reservation required connections, and months of waiting, rushed forward and bowed. Not a polite nod, not a handshake, but a deep formal bow that bent him nearly in half. "Young Master Rivera." Giovanni's voice carried clearly through the silent restaurant, his Italian accent thick with reverence and something that sounded like relief. "It is an extraordinary honor to have you with us this evening. Your table is prepared. We are entirely at your service, as always." Michael inclined his head slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and the kind of casual acceptance that came from a lifetime of such treatment. He said something too quiet for me to hear, and Giovanni straightened, nodding frantically, gesturing toward the entrance with the eagerness of someone who desperately wanted to please. Then Michael began walking toward the restaurant, and it was like watching a force of nature in human form. The security detail moved ahead of him, and every single person in that space stepped back instinctively. The doors opened before he reached them. Staff members bowed their heads as he passed, not out of fear, but out of respect that looked practiced and genuine. He walked through the entrance past the hostess stand, where the young woman literally curtsied past the bar where the bartender had frozen mid-shake of a cocktail shaker. He walked into our private dining room, and every eye in the restaurant followed his path. He walked straight toward our table, and with each step, I felt the world I thought I knew crumbling and reforming into something I couldn't quite comprehend. My father's mouth had fallen open, his carefully cultivated authority evaporating like morning dew. Brad had gone pale, all the color draining from his face as understanding began to dawn. Isabel stared at me with wide eyes, her expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like betrayal. Michael stopped beside my chair, and when he looked down at me, his eyes held the same warmth and love they always did. But now there was something else there too. Vindication, justice, and maybe a touch of satisfaction. But Michael wasn't the only one hiding a fortune. Michael sat down in his chair with the same calm grace he'd walked in with, as if having a security guard standing 3 feet behind him was the most natural thing in the world. Giovanni himself, not a server, not a manager, but the legendary owner, appeared at Michael's elbow with a bottle of wine I recognized from the menu, the one that cost $1,200. "Your preferred vintage young master," Giovanni said softly, pouring with hands that shook slightly. "From your personal reserve, we keep here." The entire restaurant was still staring. Conversations at other tables had completely ceased. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on us, on Michael, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Brad was the first to attempt recovery. He'd gone pale, but now color was creeping back into his cheeks, and I could see his mind working frantically behind his eyes, trying to recalibrate, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. Michael?" His voice came out higher than normal, stripped of its earlier swagger. "Those limousines outside, are those yours? Or company vehicles? Corporate fleet?" Michael took a sip of his wine unhurried, letting the question hang in the air for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the silent room. "Mine." One word, just one word, but it landed like a bomb. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I could hear someone's phone buzzing on vibrate 3 tables away. I could hear the kitchen staff behind the swinging doors still working because they had no idea what drama was unfolding in the dining room. Isabel's face had transformed from shock to something uglier, something that looked like rage mixed with humiliation, mixed with a desperate need to reassert her position as the superior sister. She turned on me with sudden venom, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You knew about this." It was an accusation, not a question. "You knew about all of this all along. You lied to us. You lied to the whole family." For 20 years, that tone of voice from Isabel would have made me shrink, would have made me apologize reflexively, try to smooth things over, make myself smaller so she could feel bigger. For 20 years, I'd been trained to back down to accept blame. I didn't deserve to let her win every confrontation because that's what kept the peace. Not tonight. I stood up slowly and I felt something shift in my spine and my shoulders in the way I held my head. For the first time in 2 decades, I didn't apologize. I didn't shrink. I met Isabel's eyes directly and spoke in a voice that didn't shake, didn't waver, didn't ask for permission to exist. "I didn't lie to anyone," I said clearly, each word deliberate and precise. "I simply didn't advertise, just like I didn't advertise about myself." Isabel's sneer was reflexive, automatic, the same expression she'd perfected over years of putting me down. "What do you have to advertise?" The question was designed to cut to remind everyone at the table of my supposed insignificance. I smiled then, and I felt the weight of every lonely night, every dismissal, every time I'd been made to feel invisible, pressing against the back of that smile. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd survived something that should have destroyed her. "I am the CEO and sole owner of Ramirez Logistics," I said, and I didn't raise my voice. Didn't shout, but my words carried across the entire restaurant like I was speaking through a microphone. "My company employs 400 people. We operate across 6 states: Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Utah. Last year, we generated $25 million in revenue." The table didn't just go silent. It froze. My father's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's hand reaching for her napkin hung suspended in midair. Brad's eyes went wide. Isabel's sneer melted into something that looked like she'd been slapped. Carlos was the first to find his voice, and it came out strangled, disbelieving. That's impossible. You were just a dispatcher. You said you were still working in trucking. You said—" "I said I was still in trucking." I interrupted, my voice steady and calm. "I never said I was a dispatcher. You assumed that because you never bothered to ask, because you never cared enough to ask." I looked at each of them in turn, my father, my mother, my sister. "I built this company over 12 years. I started with 3 trucks and 2 employees. I worked 80-hour weeks. I took out loans with interest rates that should have been criminal. I rebuilt my credit from nothing after someone destroyed it." I let that statement hang there, seeing my father flinch. He knew. On some level, he had to know. I did all of this without family money, without connections, without anyone believing I could do it. I did it through hard work and intelligence, and refusing to let your voices in my head tell me I wasn't good enough. I turned to Isabel, and my voice softened slightly, but not with weakness, with pity. "You mentioned closing a big deal earlier. I'm happy for you, truly. But your deal was a $50,000 social media campaign. Each of my contracts, the contracts I negotiate regularly, is worth millions. Plural. I have 18-wheeler trucks with my company's name on them driving through 6 states right now. I have drivers whose families I helped save from foreclosure. I have warehouses, distribution centers, contracts with companies you've heard of." Some of the relatives at the far end of the table began to stand. My cousin Jennifer started clapping slowly at first, then others joined. Aunt Rosa had tears in her eyes. Uncle Victor was nodding, a smile breaking across his face. "I knew it," he said to no one in particular. "I always knew Angela had it in her." But my eyes were on my parents, on Isabel, on Brad. My father wasn't clapping. He sat perfectly still, and the expression on his face made my stomach turn. It wasn't pride, it wasn't shame. It wasn't any of the emotions a father should feel when learning his daughter had achieved massive success against impossible odds. It was calculation. His eyes had taken on that distant quality I remembered from childhood, the look he got when he was figuring out angles, working through possibilities, determining how something could benefit him. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes at all. She stared down at her plate like the pattern on the china held the secrets of the universe. Her hands twisted together in her lap. Isabel looked like she was going to be sick. Her face had gone from crimson to a grayish white, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly garish against her pale skin. She turned to Brad, seeking support, seeking someone to tell her this wasn't happening. But Brad wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Michael with an expression I recognized, the look of someone doing financial calculations, someone seeing dollar signs, someone realizing they'd massively miscalculated who held power in this room. And in that moment, watching my family's faces, I understood something that broke my heart even as it set me free. My success didn't make them proud. It didn't make them happy for me. It didn't make them realize they'd been wrong about me all these years. It just made them see me as an opportunity, as something useful, as a resource they could finally exploit. I'd spent 20 years thinking that if I could just prove myself, if I could just succeed enough, they would finally see me, finally value me, finally love me the way parents are supposed to love their children. But I'd been chasing an impossible dream, because they would never see me as a person, only as a tool. Just like they'd seen me as a convenient scapegoat when I was young, now they saw me as a convenient bank account. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt like the last chain breaking free. Michael leaned over, then close enough that only I could hear, and whispered in my ear, "They still don't know everything." We left the restaurant before dessert was served. I couldn't bear to sit at that table anymore, watching my father's calculating eyes, my mother's averted gaze, Isabel's mixture of rage and humiliation. Michael's security drove us to our hotel in one of those black limousines, the interior so quiet I could hear my own breathing, so luxurious it felt like sitting inside a jewelry box. Neither of us spoke during the drive. What was there to say? Everything we'd both been hiding had been exposed in the span of 20 minutes. Our entire relationship had been built on secrets we'd kept from the world. And now those secrets were scattered across a restaurant table for my family to pick through like vultures. When we reached our suite, and I realized then that Michael had booked us into the penthouse, not the standard room I'd assumed, he poured us both whiskey from the minibar and gestured for me to sit on the sofa. His face was serious, but his eyes were gentle. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Something I should have told you years ago." My stomach clenched. After everything that had happened tonight, I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation. But I nodded, gripping my whiskey glass like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. "I didn't meet you by accident at that conference," Michael said quietly. "I knew who you were before we met." The words hit me like cold water. "What?" He set his glass down and leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. 2 years before that conference, Rivtech was researching potential partnerships with mid-sized logistics companies. We were looking for firms that had strong growth trajectories, ethical business practices, operational efficiency. My team put together a short list of candidates. He paused, watching my face. Ramirez Logistics was in the top 3. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was saying. "I read your company's profile personally," Michael continued. "The case study my analysts prepared. From night dispatcher to CEO in 12 years. No investors, no family money, just intelligent decisions and relentless work. Fair wages, low turnover, steady growth without cutting corners." His voice softened. "But what made me decide to meet you personally wasn't just the business metrics. It was your personal story. The fact that you'd built all of this while being completely unsupported by your family, while being actively undermined by them. You investigated me." The words came out sharper than I intended. "Not in the way you're thinking," he said quickly. "This was business research, public records, industry reports. But yes, I learned about your background, and when I did, I recognized something. Someone who'd fought the same battles I had. Someone who'd been seen as a tool rather than a person by the people who should have loved them most." He met my eyes directly. "I wanted to see if you were real. If the woman in those reports was as remarkable in person as she seemed on paper. So I arranged to be at that conference. I positioned myself where you'd be. I created those coincidental meetings." I should have been angry. I should have felt manipulated, deceived, used. But all I felt was a strange kind of numbness, like I'd used up all my emotional capacity at dinner and had nothing left. "My feelings for you were real," Michael said, his voice urgent now. "Are real. I fell in love with you the moment we started talking, when I realized you were even more remarkable than your business profile suggested. But I needed you to know the truth about how we met because you need to understand what came next." He stood and retrieved a leather folder from his briefcase. When he sat back down, he placed it on the coffee table between us and opened it carefully, like it contained something fragile and dangerous. "When I started caring about you, when I realized this wasn't just a business acquaintance but someone who mattered to me deeply, I wanted to protect you," he said. "So I had my legal team do a more thorough investigation of your family, not to control you, not to manipulate you, but to understand what you'd overcome, to know what I might need to help you defend yourself against." He pulled out the first document and slid it across to me. It was a letter. Old, slightly yellowed at the edges, the Stanford University logo embossed at the top. Dated 18 years ago. Addressed to Angela Maria Ramirez at my childhood home address. "Dear Ms. Ramirez." I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to receive the Martinez Family Scholarship for first-generation college students. This full-ride scholarship covers tuition room board and books for 4 years of undergraduate study in computer science." My hands started shaking so violently I couldn't read the rest. I looked up at Michael, and he had tears in his eyes. "I never got this letter," I whispered. They told me the scholarship fell through. They said I didn't qualify after all. They said I should just get a job instead of wasting time on education." "Your parents intercepted it," Michael said gently. "The scholarship required a response within 2 weeks. When you didn't reply, they offered it to the first alternate on the waiting list. He paused, and I could see him steeling himself to deliver the next blow. That alternate was Isabel. Your sister went to Stanford on the scholarship that was meant for you. Your parents forged documents, changed ages, manipulated the application. They gave her your future. The room tilted. I set the letter down carefully because I couldn't trust myself not to rip it into pieces. All those years, all those times I'd wondered what my life might have been like if I'd gone to college. If I'd studied computer science like I'd dreamed about. If I'd had the education and opportunities that came with a Stanford degree. And Isabel had lived that life. My life. While I worked night shifts at a trucking company and took online courses one at a time because I couldn't afford anything else. There's more, Michael said quietly, and I nearly laughed because of course there was more. There was always more. He showed me the next set of documents, credit card applications. 3 of them, all from when I was 18 and 19 years old. All in my name. All with signatures that looked like mine but weren't quite right the way a forged signature never is. Your father used your identity to open these accounts, Michael explained. He ran them up to $35,000 in debt, then defaulted on all 3. That's why when you tried to get your first business loan at 21, you were denied. You had a credit score of 480 and a history of unpaid debts. His voice was tight with controlled anger. It took you 7 years to rebuild credit you never destroyed. Every struggle you faced getting financing for your business, every high-interest loan you had to take, every bank officer who looked at you with suspicion, it was all because your own father sabotaged your credit to fund his gambling addiction. I stared at the documents spread across the coffee table, the scholarship letter, the credit card applications, the debt collection notices, the paper trail of how my family had systematically destroyed every opportunity I should have had. I'm so sorry, Michael said, and he moved to sit beside me on the sofa, taking my hands in his. You deserved to know the truth. You deserved better than this. I couldn't cry. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. I just felt empty, hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything out of me and left only a shell. How long have you known? I asked. About 6 months after we started dating. I've been waiting for the right time to tell you, but there never seemed to be a right time. And then tonight happened, and I realized you needed to know. You needed to understand that every struggle you've faced, every obstacle you've overcome, it wasn't because you weren't good enough. It was because they sabotaged you at every turn. I looked at him, this man who'd kept this devastating secret for over 2 years, who'd watched me interact with my family knowing what they'd done to me, who'd borne the weight of this knowledge alone to spare me pain. Thank you, I whispered, for finding this, for telling me. He squeezed my hands gently. There's one more thing, something even my investigators couldn't find, but I think it's there. He hesitated. Your childhood home, your mother's things. I think there might be something hidden there, something she left for you. But there was one more truth hidden in Angela's childhood home, something even Michael hadn't found yet. The day after Christmas, I drove to my childhood home alone. Michael had offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do by myself. Some ghosts you have to face without a witness. The house sat on a quiet street in an older neighborhood of Phoenix, the kind of place where the trees were tall enough to provide real shade, and the houses had character instead of the cookie-cutter sameness of newer developments. I'd bought it 6 months ago through a trust with a name that couldn't be traced back to me paying cash, so there'd be no paper trail my family could follow. They had no idea I owned it. They assumed it had been sold to developers after my mother's estate was settled. I hadn't been inside since the funeral 5 years ago. Hadn't been able to bear it. But now, with Michael's words echoing in my head about something my mother might have left for me, I found myself parking in the driveway and staring at the house that held 20 years of painful memories. The key turned easily in the lock. I'd had the utilities kept on, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe some part of me always knew I'd need to come back here eventually. Walking through those rooms felt like moving through a museum of my own damaged childhood. The living room where I'd sat invisible during family gatherings. The kitchen where I'd eaten birthday cupcakes alone. The hallway where dozens of photos hung on the wall, Isabel at every age smiling and celebrated with only 3 pictures of me tucked in the corners like afterthoughts. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the banister I'd touched thousands of times as a girl. My old bedroom door was closed. I didn't open it. I wasn't ready for that particular ghost. Instead, I went to my mother's room. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, that floral scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember. The furniture was covered in dust sheets now, but I could see the shape of her vanity, her dresser, the chair where she used to sit and read in the evenings when my father was out doing whatever it was he did. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser exactly where it had always been. Dark wood inlaid with mother of pearl, a gift from her own mother who'd passed away before I was born. I opened it carefully, and the familiar melody of Cielito Lindo began to play, the mechanical music box mechanism still working after all these years. I started to lift out the trays of jewelry, nothing expensive, mostly costume pieces and a few sentimental items, when I noticed something. The velvet lining of the bottom compartment was loose in one corner. I pulled at it gently, and it came away to reveal a small space underneath. A USB drive wrapped in soft cloth, and a note folded once in my mother's handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Para mi ángela fuerte. Watch this alone. Te amo siempre. Mamá. For my strong Angela. Watch this alone. I love you always. I sat down hard on the edge of her bed, clutching the USB drive like it might disappear if I didn't hold it tight enough. My laptop was in the car. I went to get it, my legs feeling disconnected from my body, and brought it back up to her room. Some things needed to be witnessed in the place where they were created. The USB drive slid into the port. A single video file appeared. I clicked it with a trembling finger. The screen filled with my mother's face, and I gasped. She looked so much thinner than I remembered, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes too large in her gaunt face. This had been filmed near the end when the cancer was winning. But her eyes were fierce, determined, filled with a strength I'd rarely seen her display when she was alive. She was sitting right here in this room, in the chair by the window, the same light falling across her face. Angela, mi amor, she began. And the sound of her voice, after 5 years of silence, broke something in me. If you're watching this, I'm gone, and I need you to know the truth. I need you to know that I saw everything. Tears were already streaming down my face, but I couldn't look away. I know what your father and sister did to you, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I know about the scholarship they stole. I know about treating you como nada, like you were nothing, like you didn't matter. I know about the credit cards, the lies, the way they took every opportunity that should have been yours and gave it to Isabel. She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. I tried to stop them, Hija. I fought with your father so many times. I screamed at him. I threatened to leave. But he controlled everything. The money, our social connections, even my access to you girls. He isolated me. Made me financially dependent. Told me if I left, I'd lose both my daughters. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I couldn't save you then, Angela. I was weak. I was scared. I chose the wrong thing. I chose to stay and keep what little influence I had rather than take you away from that toxicity. And I will regret that for whatever time I have left. She reached beside her and held up a manila envelope. But I can give you this. Inside is the deed to a piece of land I bought 15 years ago when your grandmother left me a small inheritance that your father didn't know about. It's in your name only. It wasn't worth much then, but I checked recently and the city is developing around it. It could be worth hundreds of thousands now, maybe more. She set the envelope down and leaned closer to the camera, and it was like she was looking directly into my soul. You were always the strongest, mi Angelita, the smartest, the most capable. Isabel got the attention, but you got the strength. You got the resilience. You got everything that actually matters. Her voice cracked. Don't ever let them make you feel pequeña pequeñita. Don't ever let them shrink you down to fit their idea of who you should be. You owe them nothing. Not your success, not your money, not your time, not your forgiveness. Nothing. She touched her fingers to her lips and then to the camera. Te amo, mija. I always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it in a way that mattered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The video ended. I sat there in the silence of my mother's room, tears running down my face unchecked, and for the first time in my entire life I felt truly seen by my mother. Not the mother who'd lived the woman who'd been too controlled and too afraid to protect me properly, but this mother, the one who'd gathered her courage at the end of her life to tell me the truth, to give me proof that I wasn't crazy, that the favoritism had been real, that she'd seen it too. I made it, Mama, I whispered to the empty room. I'm okay now. I'm more than okay. I survived them all. I closed my laptop and wiped my eyes. And that's when I noticed something else in the jewelry box, something I'd missed before tucked under where the USB drive had been hidden. A small book with a worn cover, a diary with flowers drawn on it in marker, the kind of thing a teenage girl would have, with Isabel's name written on the front. And hidden in the same box was Isabel's teenage diary filled with confessions Angela was never meant to see. I picked up the diary with hands that had already cried themselves out, wondering what else could possibly hurt me today. The cover was worn, decorated with flowers drawn in marker, the kind of thing a teenage girl would create back when the world still seemed manageable enough to be contained in a notebook. Isabel's name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. The dates inside ranged from when she was 15 to 17 years old. The years when I was leaving home, when I was escaping, when I thought she was living in luxury while I struggled. I shouldn't read it. I knew that. This was private, personal, something my mother had hidden for reasons I didn't understand. But after everything I'd learned tonight after the scholarship, the credit fraud, my mother's video, I needed to know. I needed to understand the sister who'd spent 2 decades helping to destroy me. The first entry was dated 3 days after Isabel's 15th birthday. Everyone thinks I have it easy, she'd written in her teenage script, still rounded and careful. Mom and Dad give me everything, the nice clothes, the expensive birthday party, the private tutors. Angela acts like I'm so lucky, but she doesn't see the price. Nobody sees the price. I turned the page, my heart beating faster. Dad screamed at me for an hour today because I got an A- in chemistry. An A-. He said I'm the successful daughter and I can't afford to slip even once. He said people are watching me, judging our family by how I perform. Mom stood there crying, saying if I don't excel at everything, I'll end up worthless like Angela. They said Angela's name like it was a curse. Like being me was the only thing keeping me from being her. My breath caught in my throat. The entries continued, each one revealing a layer of suffering I'd never imagined existed behind Isabel's perfect facade. Dad forcing her into extra SAT prep sessions even though she was having panic attacks. Mom making her practice her smile in the mirror because pretty girls who smile get further in life. The crushing weight of conditional love that could be withdrawn at any moment if she failed to perform. I'm so tired of being perfect, one entry read. Angela is lucky in a way. No one expects anything from her, so she's free to just exist. I'm trapped in this golden cage where every move I make is scrutinized. Every grade, every outfit, every friend, every word has to be perfect, or I'll lose everything. Then I found the entry that made my hands shake. I did something terrible today. I found Angela's college scholarship letter in Dad's desk drawer. I don't know why he hid it. Maybe he was going to throw it away. But I saw it, and I knew if Angela went to Stanford, if she succeeded, then I wouldn't be special anymore. Dad would see that he picked the wrong daughter to invest in. So I didn't say anything. I let him take it. I let him give my acceptance letter to Stanford to me instead, even though I knew it was supposed to be hers. I'm a terrible person, but I'm so scared of what happens to me if Angela becomes the successful one. Tears blurred my vision. Not tears of anger, tears of something more complicated. something that felt like grief for both of us. Further entries detailed other sabotages. My high school science fair project that mysteriously got damaged the night before the competition, Isabel had knocked it over on purpose. My college recommendation letter from Mr. Harrison that never arrived, Isabel had intercepted it. Small cruelties committed out of desperation, each one followed by entries filled with self-loathing and fear. "I know it's wrong," she'd written. "I hate myself for hurting her. But in those moments when I sabotage her, I feel like I have some control over my own life. Like I'm not just a puppet performing for Dad's approval. I'm just someone who exists. Someone who makes choices, even terrible ones." The final entry was dated a week before I left home. "Angela is leaving. She's moving out the day she turns 18. Part of me is relieved maybe with her gone the pressure will ease. But part of me is terrified. Because if she leaves and builds a life without them, she'll prove that their approval doesn't matter. And I don't know how to exist without their approval. I don't know who I am if I'm not the perfect daughter." I closed the diary and sat in the silence of my mother's room, understanding flooding through me like cold water. Isabel hadn't been the favored child living a blessed life. She'd been a different kind of prisoner. Where I'd been neglected and starved of attention, she'd been suffocated and controlled with impossible expectations. Where I'd been told I was worthless, she'd been told she had to be perfect or become worthless. We were two sides of the same coin of parental abuse. Our parents hadn't loved either of us. They'd used both of us, me as a scapegoat, her as a trophy. They'd damaged both their daughters just in different ways and then pitted us against each other so we'd never realize the real enemy wasn't each other. It was them. I felt anger, yes, for the scholarship, for the sabotages, for the years of cruelty. But underneath that anger was something unexpected. Compassion. Pity. The recognition that Isabel and I were both victims of the same toxic system. But Isabel was about to fall into a trap of her own making, one that would cost her everything. 2 weeks after that disastrous Christmas dinner, I received a call from my cousin Jennifer. We'd grown closer since she'd stood and applauded for me at Marchetti's, one of the few relatives who'd shown genuine support rather than opportunistic interest. "Angela, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice tight with concern. "It's about Isabel." My stomach clenched. After reading her diary, after understanding the prison she'd lived in, I'd been thinking about reaching out to her, trying to bridge the gap between us now that I understood we'd both been victims. But I hadn't worked up the courage yet. "Brad introduced her to some kind of investment opportunity," Jennifer continued. "Green energy startup or something. She's talking about investing everything her savings plus a loan. She's desperate to prove she can be as successful as you. Angela, I'm worried she's making a terrible decision, but she won't listen to anyone." After Jennifer hung up, I spent the next 3 hours doing what I do best, research. The company was called Solar Bright Innovations, and on the surface it looked legitimate. Professional website. Charismatic CEO named David Chen giving TED-style talks about sustainable energy. Testimonials from supposed investors who doubled their money in months. Press releases about revolutionary solar panel technology. But I'd been in business long enough to recognize the signs. The testimonials used stock photos I found on 3 other websites. David Chen's biography didn't match any educational records I could find. The revolutionary technology was described in vague terms that meant nothing to anyone who actually understood solar engineering. The promised returns, 300% in 6 months, were impossibly high for any legitimate investment. I dug deeper. David Chen was actually David Chenoweth, who'd served 3 years for securities fraud in Nevada under his full name before changing it legally and moving to Arizona. Solar Bright Innovations had no actual assets, no patents, no manufacturing facilities. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, paying early investors with money from new investors while the founders siphoned funds offshore. Isabel was about to lose everything. $150,000 in savings. Another $100,000 in a loan Brad had co-signed, probably thinking he'd married into money and could afford the risk. I sat in my office staring at my computer screen, facing a choice that had no easy answer. I could call Isabel directly, warn her, show her my research. But I knew how that would play out. She'd think I was lying out of jealousy. She'd accuse me of trying to sabotage her success. The family would rally around her, calling me bitter and vindictive. And she'd invest anyway just to prove me wrong. I could do nothing. Let her learn the hard way, the same way I'd had to learn everything in my life through painful experience and costly mistakes. Or I could find a middle path. I spent the next day executing a plan that would expose the fraud without making me the villain. First, I compiled all my research and submitted an anonymous tip to the SEC with enough evidence to trigger an investigation. Then I did something more direct. The scammers had chosen their company name to sound similar to SolarBright Technologies, a legitimate solar company based in California. I contacted SolarBright Technologies' legal department and explained the situation. Within 12 hours, they issued a public statement clarifying that they had no affiliation with SolarBright Innovations and warning investors about the fraudulent company using a similar name. I also bought a small stake in the legitimate SolarBright Technologies, giving me standing to push for that public clarification. The legitimate company's statement went out on Business Wire services and was picked up by investment news sites. Within 48 hours, investors started pulling out of SolarBright Innovations. Within 72 hours, the scheme collapsed entirely, the website went dark, and David Chen disappeared. Isabel had already transferred $50,000 in initial deposits. That money was gone, vanished into offshore accounts that would take years to trace if they could be traced at all. But the rest of her savings and the loan were still safe because the collapse happened before those transfers completed. I'd saved her from total ruin, but she'd still lost enough to hurt. My phone rang 3 days later. My father's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "This is your fault," he said without preamble. "Isabel lost money because you didn't warn her. You knew about this investment and you said nothing." The accusation was so predictable I almost laughed. How would I have known about Isabel's private investment decisions? I asked calmly. "We haven't spoken since Christmas." "You should have been watching out for your sister." My mother's voice came through on speakerphone. "Family takes care of family." "I've spent 20 years trying to warn this family about poor decisions," I said, keeping my voice level. "No one has ever listened, not once. Tell me, why would this time be different? If I'd called Isabel and told her not to invest, would she have listened? Or would she have accused me of jealousy and invested anyway, just to prove me wrong?" Silence on the other end. They knew I was right. "She lost $50,000. My father said, his voice tight. "Money she needed. Money she'd saved for years." "Then maybe she'll learn to do proper research before investing," I replied. "Maybe she'll learn that if something promises 300% returns in 6 months, it's too good to be true. These are lessons I had to learn the hard way because no one helped me. Why should she be protected from consequences I had to face alone?" I hung up before they could respond. Isabel called me that evening, her voice thick with tears. "I know you probably think I deserve this," she said. "I know you're probably happy I failed." "I'm not happy," I said honestly, "but I'm not going to save you from your own choices either." "Brad says it's my fault," she whispered. "He says I should have known better. He's been distant ever since the money disappeared. He won't answer my calls half the time." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Isabel, where is Brad right now?" "I don't know. He said he needed some space to think about our relationship." And then Brad disappeared along with Isabel's remaining funds. 1 week after that phone call, Isabel showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant buzzed me, her voice uncertain. "Ms. Ramirez, your sister is here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." I hadn't seen Isabel since Christmas dinner. When she walked into my office, I barely recognized her. No designer clothes, no perfectly styled hair, no confident smile. She wore jeans and a plain sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of makeup and swollen from crying. "He's gone," she said without preamble, her voice hollow. "Brad cleaned out our joint bank account. $23,000, everything I'd managed to save after the investment disaster. Her hands shook as she pulled papers from her purse and spread them on my desk. And this, a loan for $25,000 that he convinced me to co-sign 2 months ago. He said it was for a business opportunity. The bank is saying I'm responsible for it. I looked at the loan documents. Her signature was there, legal and binding, making her liable for debt she'd never seen a penny of. His phone goes straight to voicemail. Isabel continued, her voice breaking. His apartment is empty. I went to his office and they said he quit 3 days ago, just walked out and never came back. He's gone, Angela. He took everything and he's just gone. She collapsed into the chair across from my desk and started crying. Not the delicate, controlled tears of someone who wants sympathy, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world has completely fallen apart. I should have felt satisfaction. Some vindictive part of me wanted to feel satisfaction. But sitting there watching my sister break down, all I felt was a tired kind of sadness for both of us. "Let me look into this," I said quietly. Michael's security team was the same one that had investigated my family's financial crimes. Within 48 hours, they had Brad's entire life mapped out in a way that made my blood run cold. Brad Wilson wasn't his real name. He was Bradley Wilcox, and he had a history. Small-time cons, identity theft, romance fraud. He'd served 18 months in county jail in Nevada for defrauding an elderly woman out of her retirement savings. He'd been working for Viktor Sokolov for the past 3 years. And that's where the story got darker. Viktor Sokolov ran a loan operation that wasn't technically illegal, but operated in the gray spaces of the law. He made loans to people with gambling problems, people who couldn't get credit anywhere else, people desperate enough to accept his terms. People like my father. The security report laid it out in stark detail. Carlos had been borrowing from Sokolov for over 8 years. First, small amounts to cover gambling losses. Then, larger amounts to pay off previous loans. The debt had spiraled to over $200,000. When Carlos couldn't pay, when he'd exhausted every excuse and extension Sokolov had sent Brad's assignment was simple: infiltrate the Ramirez family, assess their assets, and extract payment one way or another. He was supposed to target Carlos directly. But then Brad met Isabel at a networking event, and Isabel, desperate to appear successful and wealthy, had bragged endlessly about her successful family business and family money. Brad had pivoted. Why squeeze money from a desperate broke gambler when you could romance his daughter, who apparently came from wealth? Every moment of their relationship had been calculated. Every gesture of affection, every promise of a future together, every conversation about investments and opportunities, all of it was part of a con designed to extract as much money as possible before disappearing. The bitter irony was almost poetic. My father's gambling addiction, his weakness, his desperate borrowing, had sent a predator straight to his own daughter's door. Brad was the consequence of Carlos's choices, but Isabel was the one who paid the price. I sat Isabel down in my office and showed her the report. I watched the color drain from her face as she read about Brad's real identity, his criminal history, his assignment from Sokolov. "I was a mark," she whispered. "The whole time I was just a mark." "Yes," I said, because she needed to hear the truth. "Did you know?" she asked, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Did you suspect?" "I knew he wasn't what he pretended to be," I admitted. "I didn't know the extent of it until now. Why didn't you warn me? Would you have listened?" She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, I would have thought you were jealous, trying to sabotage my happiness." "I know." I hired one of the best fraud attorneys in Phoenix to help Isabel. We built a case proving she'd been defrauded, that she'd signed those loan documents under false pretenses, that Brad had deliberately deceived her. It took weeks, but we got her released from liability for most of the debt. I also made sure Brad's fraud was reported to every relevant authority. His real name and face were circulated. His schemes were exposed. He'd never work in finance again, never run another con without someone recognizing him. When it was done, Isabel sat in my office one more time. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "After everything I did to you, the scholarship, the sabotage, all of it?" I thought about her diary about the scared teenager who'd sabotaged me out of desperation rather than malice. About two sisters damaged by the same parents in different ways. "Because I'm not helping the sister who hurt me," I said. "I'm helping the sister who was also hurt by the same people. We were both victims, Isabel, just in different ways. I don't deserve your help." "Maybe not. But I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." I leaned forward. "But this comes with conditions. You're going to therapy. You're going to stop blaming other people for your choices. You're going to face the fact that our parents destroyed both of us, and you're going to heal from it. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face again. "Yes, I'll try." "Good." But Angela's biggest confrontation was still ahead with her parents who refused to see the truth. 3 weeks after helping Isabel with Brad's fraud case, I received a phone call from my mother that I almost didn't answer. Her voice came through hesitant, almost meek, a tone I'd rarely heard from her. "Angela, your father and I would like to talk with you," she said carefully. "About everything that's happened, about our family. We think it's time we had an honest conversation, just the four of us. A chance to heal." I should have known better. But some stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered being 8 years old and desperately wanting my parents' approval, agreed. I told Michael about the invitation and he insisted on coming with me. "I'm not letting you walk into that house alone," he said firmly. "Not after everything they've done." My childhood home looked different in the afternoon light. Smaller, somehow less imposing than it had seemed in my memories. My father opened the door wearing a cardigan I'd never seen before, his smile warm but strained around the edges. "Angela, Michael, please come in," he said, gesturing us toward the living room. "Thank you for coming. We know this has been a difficult time for everyone." My mother had prepared coffee and pastries arranged on the good china we'd only used for special occasions when I was growing up. She poured carefully, her hand steady, her smile practiced. For the first 20 minutes they performed contrition beautifully. My father acknowledged that perhaps they hadn't always been perfectly fair in how they'd treated their daughters. My mother admitted that maybe they'd put too much pressure on Isabel and not given me enough attention. Everything was couched in careful language, may have made mistakes, could have done better, didn't always understand, but never "we were wrong," never "we hurt you," never actual accountability. Then the conversation shifted so smoothly I almost missed the transition. "With everything Isabel has been through with Brad," my father said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, "she still has some debts to clear, about $30,000. As her family, we thought perhaps we could help her." "You want me to pay off her debts?" I interrupted, the realization landing like a stone in my stomach. "Well, family should help family," my mother said quickly. "You're in such a strong position now, Angela. You're successful. You have resources. It would be such a small thing for you, but it would mean everything to your sister." My father continued before I could respond. "And actually, there's a business opportunity I've been looking into, a franchise opportunity that could really secure our family's future. I just need about $200,000 to invest." $200,000, I said flatly. "It's a loan," he clarified, though his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. "We'd pay you back, of course, with interest if you'd like. We're just going through some temporary financial difficulties. A few investments that haven't paid off yet. Cash flow problems. You know how it is." Michael's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "Where were these family obligations when I needed you?" The question came out quieter than I'd intended, but it cut through the room like a knife. "When I was 19, working 3 jobs to pay rent. When I was 21 and banks wouldn't give me a loan. When I was building my company and you mocked me at every family gathering." "That was different," my father said, his voice taking on an edge. "You were learning independence. We were teaching you valuable life lessons. You stole my college scholarship and gave it to Isabel," I said, watching his face carefully. You opened credit cards in my name and destroyed my credit before I even knew what credit was. You sabotaged every opportunity I should have had. Those weren't life lessons. That was abuse. We always did our best, my mother said, her voice rising. We were fair to both our daughters. You're being ungrateful, Angela. You're holding grudges over nothing, over ancient history that doesn't even matter anymore. We sacrificed so much for you girls, my father added, standing now, his body language shifting from apologetic to aggressive. And now when we need help, you're turning your back on your own family after everything we've done for you. The gaslighting was so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. This was the pattern I'd lived with my entire childhood: deny, deflect, make me doubt my own reality. But this time I didn't doubt. This time I watched my father carefully and saw things I hadn't noticed before. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured. His eyes kept darting to his phone on the coffee table, which had buzzed 3 times since we'd arrived. The tension in his shoulders, the way he kept swallowing like his mouth was too dry, the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. These weren't the signs of someone going through temporary cash flow problems. These were the signs of someone in serious trouble. Someone being pressured. Someone who owed money to people who didn't accept excuses. I stood up and Michael rose with me. I'm not giving you money, I said clearly. Not because I'm vindictive or holding grudges, but because giving you money would enable whatever behavior has gotten you into this situation. Whatever financial trouble you're in, you created it, and you need to face the consequences yourself. Carlos's carefully maintained composure cracked. His face flushed red, his voice rising to something close to a shout. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea what I'm dealing with. You have no idea. He cut himself off, breathing hard, and I saw fear flash across his face. Real fear. Goodbye, I said, walking toward the door. If you walk out that door, my father called after me, his voice desperate now, don't expect to come back. Don't expect us to welcome you with open arms when you finally realize how selfish you're being. I paused at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. I stopped expecting anything from you the day you didn't show up to my high school graduation, I said. This isn't me giving up on you. This is me accepting who you've always been. Michael and I walked to the car in silence. As we pulled away, I saw my father standing at the window phone pressed to his ear, his mouth moving urgently. We need to find out exactly what he's hiding, I said to Michael. This is bigger than bad investments or cash flow problems. I'll have my team look into it, Michael replied, and the first truth would be revealed through a single legal envelope. Michael's forensic team worked faster than I expected. 5 days after our visit to my parents' house, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my office. Inside was a report that made my hands shake as I read. I'd hired the best forensic accountant in Arizona, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in financial fraud cases. What she found was worse than anything Michael's initial investigation had uncovered. Carlos hadn't just opened 3 credit cards in my name when I was 18 and 19. There were 6 accounts total. 3 credit cards with a combined debt of $47,000. A car title loan for $12,000 taken out using forged documents with my signature defaulted after 6 months. 2 personal loans from predatory lenders totaling $18,000 using my information as collateral without my knowledge or consent. Every single one had been opened when I was barely an adult, when I wouldn't have known to check my credit, when I trusted that my parents wouldn't hurt me in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. But what made me feel physically sick was where the money had gone. Patricia had traced every dollar with the precision of a surgeon. 73% had gone to casinos, both physical locations in Nevada and online gambling sites. 18% had gone to paying off previous gambling debts, a cycle of borrowing from one source to pay another. 9% had gone to loan sharks like Viktor Sokolov, the same man who'd sent Brad to destroy my sister. The report included a timeline. Carlos's gambling addiction stretched back over 25 years, starting small with weekend trips to Vegas, escalating to online poker sites where he could lose thousands in a single night from the comfort of his home office. The addiction had consumed every spare dollar the family had, then moved on to money they didn't have, then finally to money stolen from his own daughter's future. There was a note in the margin of page 17 in Patricia's precise handwriting: "Subject spouse likely aware. Patterns suggest deliberate concealment from children, but knowledge within marriage." My mother had known. All those years she'd known what he was doing and had stayed silent. I remembered my mother's video, her words about being isolated and controlled. Now I understood the full picture. She'd known about the gambling, had probably tried to stop it, but Carlos had controlled their finances so completely that she'd felt powerless. That didn't excuse her silence, her complicity in how they'd treated me, but it explained the prison she'd lived in. I called my lawyer that afternoon. The legal strategy we developed wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries and consequences. Two things my family had never had to face. First, my lawyers filed comprehensive documents with all 3 credit bureaus, providing detailed evidence of identity theft and forgery. Each fraudulent account was challenged with supporting documentation, handwriting analysis, proving the signatures weren't mine, proof of my age when the accounts were opened, evidence that I'd never received any benefit from the debts. This legally transferred responsibility back to Carlos where it belonged. The debts he'd created in my name became his debts again. Second, I filed a police report. Not to immediately press charges, but to create an official record. To establish a paper trail that would prevent him from ever using my name again. To make it clear that this wasn't a family disagreement, it was a crime. Third, my lawyers drafted a letter. Professional, detailed, devastating. The letter explained everything we'd discovered, every fraudulent account, every forged signature, every dollar traced to gambling sites and loan sharks. It made clear that I knew about Viktor Sokolov, knew about the 25 years of addiction, knew about the systematic destruction of his daughter's futures to fund his compulsion. The terms were simple. I would not pay his debts. I would not enable his addiction. I would not allow him to use my name, my reputation, or my resources ever again. If he made any attempt to do so, I would pursue full criminal prosecution without hesitation. But the letter also included an offer. If Carlos entered a certified gambling addiction treatment program within 30 days, if he worked with a financial counselor to develop a legitimate restitution plan, if he committed to recovery with evidence of actual change, I would consider not pressing criminal charges. Not forgiveness, I didn't promise that. But the possibility of avoiding prison. The choice was his. The letter was delivered by courier on a Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, my phone was ringing. First, my father, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "You can't do this. You'll destroy this family. You'll destroy me." "You destroyed yourself," I said calmly. "I'm just holding up a mirror." Then my mother called, crying, "I knew about the gambling. I should have stopped him. I should have protected you girls." But he controlled everything, Angela. Everything. I felt so trapped. "I know, Mom," I said, and I did. But knowing didn't erase the damage. Finally, Isabel called, and her voice was ice. "You've known about this for how long, and you didn't tell me Dad destroyed my entire childhood, my entire life to feed his addiction, and you just sat on this information." "I found out 5 days ago," I said, "and I'm telling you now." The family's carefully constructed facade of respectability, maintained for decades through denial and manipulation, crumbled in a single weekend. Relatives who'd heard about the Christmas restaurant incident now learned the truth about why. About the gambling addiction, about the stolen identities, about the loan sharks and the cons and the systematic destruction of 2 daughters' futures. Carlos's phone stopped ringing with friendly calls and started ringing with creditors and investigators and relatives who wanted answers. But Angela knew the most powerful confrontation wouldn't happen in a courtroom. It would happen in front of the community that defined her parents' identity. 2 weeks after the legal letter arrived at my parents' house, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a familiar voice came through, warm, gentle, with the hint of a Spanish accent that had comforted me during my mother's funeral 5 years ago. "Angela, mija, this is Father Miguel from St. Maria's." I sat down slowly, memories washing over me. St. Maria's Catholic Church had been my mother's second home for 20 years. She'd volunteered there every Saturday, helping with the food bank, organizing community events, teaching catechism to children who looked at her with the kind of love and respect I'd always craved from her. "Father Miguel," I said, "it's good to hear from you." "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," he said. "But I wanted to speak with you about something important. We're hosting a special service next Sunday, Overcoming Family Hardship Through Faith. It's a time for members of our community to share their testimonies, their struggles, their journeys toward healing. And mija, I would be deeply honored if you would consider speaking." My throat tightened. "Father, I don't think—" "I loved your mother very much," he interrupted gently. "Rosa was one of the finest people I've ever known. And I watched you grow up in this parish, Angela. I saw how you were treated. I saw how you became invisible in your own family." His voice carried decades of observation, of compassion held in check by the boundaries of his position. "Your mother would want you to tell your story. These people are community, they need to hear it. Not everyone has the courage to break free from toxic family systems. You can give hope to others who are suffering in silence." I thought about my mother's video, her final message telling me I was strong. Maybe this was what she'd meant. Maybe telling my story wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking the silence that had protected my family's lies for so long. "I'll do it," I said. Michael found me that evening sitting on our back patio, staring at nothing. When I told him about Father Miguel's invitation, he pulled his chair close to mine. "You don't have to expose them," he said. "Just tell your truth. Let people draw their own conclusions. Your story is powerful enough on its own, you don't need to turn it into an attack." He was right. The truth was more devastating than any accusation I could make. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright. I dressed carefully, not in the designer clothes I could now afford, but in a simple dress that felt honest. Michael drove his hand, finding mine whenever we stopped at red lights. St. Maria's was exactly as I remembered it. The same wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The same stained glass windows casting colored light across the stone floor. The same scent of incense and candles and old prayer books. The church was packed. Over 300 people filled every pew, stood along the walls, crowded in the back. As I walked down the center aisle with Father Miguel, I saw faces I recognized, neighbors from my childhood, my mother's friends from the volunteer committee, families who'd known the Ramirez name for decades. And there, in their usual pew, third row from the front on the right side, sat my parents. Carlos wore a dark suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Maria sat beside him in a navy dress with pearls, her hands folded in her lap like a portrait of pious devotion. They were playing their roles perfectly. The respected community members, the devoted church parishioners, the loving parents. Father Miguel introduced me with words that made my eyes sting. "This is Rosa's daughter, Angela. Many of you watched her grow up in this parish. Some of you haven't seen her in many years. She has graciously agreed to share her journey with us today." I walked to the podium on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. 300 faces looked up at me, waiting. I didn't have notes. I'd tried to write something, but every draft felt false, calculated. So I decided to simply tell the truth. I grew up feeling invisible in my own family. I began, my voice carrying clearly in the church's acoustics. Every achievement was dismissed. Every struggle was faced alone. From the time I was very young, I understood that I wasn't valued for who I was, but rather judged for failing to be someone else. I saw Carlos's jaw tighten. Maria's hands clenched together. I was told I wasn't smart enough, wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't worthy enough to deserve attention or support or love, I continued. So at 18, I left. I left because I realized that staying in that environment would destroy me. and I built a life where I could define my own worth instead of accepting someone else's definition. I talked about the years of hard work, the night shifts, the online classes, the business I built from 3 trucks and a dream. I talked about finding Michael, about discovering what real love looked like, the kind that didn't come with conditions or requirements or the constant threat of withdrawal. I learned that real family isn't determined by who shares your blood, I said, my voice gaining strength. Real family is the people who celebrate your existence, who support your dreams, who love you not for what you can give them, but for who you are. The congregation sat in absolute silence. I could see tears on many faces. Several women in the audience were nodding recognition in their eyes. They knew this story because they'd lived versions of it themselves. When I finished, the church erupted. People stood clapping, many of them crying openly. Father Miguel embraced me at the podium, whispering, "Rosa would be so proud," in my ear. As I stepped down, people crowded forward to speak with me, to share their own stories of family rejection and survival. But through the crowd, I could see my parents still sitting in their pew, frozen. And I could see their friends, people who'd known them for 30 years, glancing at them with new understanding in their eyes, then deliberately turning away. The social isolation they'd feared most was happening in real time. Their daughter's grace had exposed their cruelty more effectively than any accusation ever could. And then Isabel did something no one expected. She stood up and walked to the front of the church. As I descended from the podium, still surrounded by people wanting to shake my hand and share their stories, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Isabel was standing. Not getting up to leave, standing and waiting, her body turned toward the front of the church. The congregation noticed too. Conversations died mid-sentence. People stepped back, creating a path. Everyone in that church knew about the Ramirez sisters, about our complicated history, about the Christmas dinner disaster that had become the subject of whispered gossip throughout the community. Isabel walked forward, and I saw that her face was wet with tears, but her jaw was set with determination I'd rarely seen in her. She wore no makeup, dressed in simple black pants and a gray sweater so different from the designer clothes and perfect presentation she'd maintained her entire life. When she reached Father Miguel, she asked in a voice that carried clearly across the silent church, "May I speak?" Father Miguel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Of course, mija." Isabel turned to face the congregation, and I saw her hands trembling at her sides. 300 people stared back at her. I started to move toward her, some instinct to protect my little sister suddenly overwhelming everything else, but Michael's hand on my arm stopped me. "Let her do this," he whispered. Isabel took a breath that I could see from 10 feet away, then spoke. "My name is Isabel Ramirez. That woman who just spoke, the brave woman who just shared her story with all of you, is my older sister." Her voice cracked on the word sister, but she pushed through. "And I need to tell you all something I should have said years ago." I saw my father start to rise from his pew, his face dark with anger or panic or both. But my mother grabbed his arm with surprising strength, pulling him back down. For once, she was stopping him instead of enabling him. "Everything Angela said is true," Isabel continued, her voice growing stronger. "Every word of it. But there's more that she didn't say, more that she was too gracious to mention." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I made it worse. I actively made her suffering worse." The church was so quiet I could hear someone breathing 3 pews behind me. "I bullied her," Isabel said, and I saw her shoulders shake with the admission. "I sabotaged her. I stole opportunities that belonged to her. I participated in making her invisible. And I want you all to know, I want everyone to understand, it wasn't because I hated her." She turned then, looking directly at me, and I saw in her eyes the scared teenager from the diary, the girl trapped in her golden cage. "I did it because I was terrified," Isabel said. "Our parents taught me that if I wasn't perfect, if I didn't excel at everything, if I didn't always win, if I didn't constantly prove my worth, I would become nothing." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Like they said Angela was. They used her as a cautionary tale. They told me every single day that if I slipped, if I failed, I would end up worthless and forgotten like my older sister. I heard gasps around the room, saw shock register on faces that had known our family for decades. So I fought to stay on top by pushing her down. Isabel continued, her tears flowing freely now. Every time I sabotaged her, every time I made her feel small, I was really just trying to avoid her fate. I was trying to stay in the light by keeping her in the shadows. She turned to face our parents then, and I saw Carlos go rigid in his seat. "Mom, Dad," Isabel said, her voice clear and strong now. "You didn't just fail Angela. You failed both of us. You pitted us against each other instead of loving us for who we were. You gave Angela neglect and gave me suffocation. You starved her of attention and drowned me in expectations. You destroyed both your daughters in different ways." She paused, and I saw her take another shaking breath. "Angela survived despite you. She thrived despite you. I'm still learning how to survive. But I'm done lying for you. I'm done pretending we were a happy family. I'm done protecting your reputation at the cost of my own soul." The silence that followed was profound. Carlos sat frozen, his face ashen. Maria was crying quietly, her hands covering her mouth. Isabel turned away from them and walked directly to me. When she stood in front of me, she looked smaller, somehow younger, stripped of all the armor she'd worn our entire lives. "I'm so sorry for everything," she whispered, though in that silence everyone could hear. "You deserved so much better. Better from them and better from me. I can't take back what I did. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see what you overcame. I see how strong you are. And I'm sorry it took me so long to stop being part of your pain. Something broke open in my chest. This was my sister. Not the golden child who'd been used as a weapon against me. Not the perfect daughter who'd gotten everything while I got nothing. Just a woman who'd been damaged by the same parents in different ways, finally finding the courage to tell the truth." I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her, and she collapsed against me, sobbing. The congregation watched as two sisters embraced in the middle of St. Maria's Catholic Church. Their public reconciliation a more powerful condemnation of our parents than any accusation could have been. "We're going to be okay," I whispered into her hair. "Both of us. We're going to be okay." Father Miguel approached us, placing a hand on each of our shoulders in blessing. Around us, people were crying openly, moved by a moment of grace and healing they'd just witnessed. But Carlos wasn't finished trying to control the narrative, and his next move would force Angela to reveal the extent of his betrayal. 1 week after Isabel and I reconciled in front of the congregation at St. Maria's, my phone started ringing with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. The first was my Aunt Carmen, the one who'd given me $300 when I turned 18. "Angela, mija, have you seen what your father posted?" Her voice was tight with concern. I hadn't been on Facebook in months. Social media had never been my priority, and after everything that had happened, I'd avoided it entirely. But Carmen's call made me open the app for the first time since Christmas. Carlos's post sat at the top of my feed, already shared 43 times with over 200 comments. "My heart is heavy today," it began, and I could almost hear his voice in the carefully crafted words. "My daughters have been manipulated by outside influences into believing lies about their childhood. Were we perfect parents? No parent is perfect. But we loved our girls with everything we had. We sacrificed. We provided. We did our best with the resources and knowledge we had." The post continued, painting a picture of wounded parents bewildered by their daughter's cruelty. He referenced newfound wealth that had changed me. He talked about the importance of forgiveness and the sanctity of family bonds. He wrote about how painful it was to be rejected by children they'd devoted their lives to raising. "We ask for your prayers during this difficult time," he concluded. "Families should forgive. Families should help each other through struggles. I pray my daughters remember the values of compassion and loyalty we worked so hard to teach them." The comments section was filled with support. Praying for you, Carlos. Children today don't understand sacrifice. Success can make people forget where they came from. You and Maria are wonderful people. I'm sure this will work itself out. I read through comment after comment, watching my father successfully rewrite history for an audience that didn't know the truth. Some of these people had known our family for decades, had eaten at our table, had attended our holiday gatherings. And they believed him. But not everyone. My cousin Jennifer had commented, "Before everyone rushes to judgment, maybe we should ask why both daughters would tell the same story. Maybe we should wonder what kind of parents end up estranged from both their children." And then I saw Father Miguel's comment posted just an hour ago. "Before we judge, we should ask ourselves if we truly know what happens behind closed doors. Some families are poisonous. Sometimes the strongest act of faith is walking away from toxicity, not staying in it. I encourage this community to pray for wisdom and discernment, not assumptions." The comment had sparked a war in the replies. Some people defended Carlos. Others questioned why a priest would make such a statement. A few brave souls began sharing their own stories of family estrangement and abuse. I watched my father's carefully constructed narrative start to crack, and I knew I had to respond. But not on his terms, not in his arena. I called my lawyer that afternoon. "Don't engage on social media," she advised immediately. "That's what he wants. He wants you emotional defensive fighting with him in public where he can control the narrative." She paused. "But we can make a statement, a professional one, through your company." That evening, my company's website published a brief statement written with surgical precision by my legal team. Angela Ramirez has been advised by legal counsel not to discuss ongoing family matters publicly while legal proceedings regarding identity theft and financial fraud are active. Ms. Ramirez maintains her commitment to her community through her business, Ramirez Logistics, and her charitable works, which speak for themselves. She wishes her family healing and encourages anyone struggling with gambling addiction to seek professional help. For questions regarding the civil proceedings, please contact her legal representation. The statement was perfect. It didn't attack. It didn't defend. It simply stated facts. Legal proceedings were active. Identity theft had occurred. Financial fraud was being addressed. Gambling addiction was involved. Within an hour, the statement had been screenshot and shared across the same social media platforms where my father had posted. People who'd commented in support of Carlos suddenly went quiet. The implications were too clear to ignore. My father called me within 2 hours, his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you? How dare you make those accusations public? You're destroying me." "I didn't accuse you of anything," I said calmly. "I stated facts that are part of the public record now. The legal proceedings are real. The evidence is documented. If the truth destroys you, that's not my fault, it's yours." He hung up without another word. Over the next few days, I watched his Facebook post disappear, quietly deleted. The comments that had supported him now existed in screenshots. Others had saved, creating a permanent record of his attempt to manipulate public opinion. Friends who'd initially offered prayers and support stopped interacting with his posts. His carefully maintained image as a respectable community member crumbled under the weight of 2 simple phrases: identity theft and gambling addiction. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Just a tired kind of sadness for the waste of it all. He could have gotten help years ago. He could have faced his addiction, made amends, tried to be a better person. Instead, he'd chosen manipulation until the very end. And just when Angela thought the hardest confrontations were behind her, a phone call came that would test her capacity for forgiveness. 6 weeks after Carlos's Facebook post disappeared into digital oblivion, I stood in my kitchen preparing for a Christmas dinner that felt simultaneously terrifying and necessary. Michael and I had bought a house 3 months earlier, nothing ostentatious despite what we could afford. A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood with a backyard and good schools nearby, thinking ahead to a future we were just beginning to imagine. The dining room table was set for 5, not 22. Candles flickered in simple glass holders. The menu was homemade tamales I'd spent all morning preparing using my grandmother's recipe rice beans, fresh tortillas. This dinner would be nothing like last year's performative disaster at Marchetti's. I'd invited only 3 people, Isabel, Father Miguel, and after long consideration and several conversations with my therapist, my mother. Not my father. That bridge wasn't just burned, it was ash scattered in the wind. Isabel arrived first carrying a bottle of wine and a tentative smile. She wore dark jeans and a simple cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. No designer labels, no armor. "I brought the wine you like," she said, holding it out like an offering. "The one you mentioned at that conference years ago." I stared at her, surprised she'd remembered such a small detail from a conversation we'd had before everything exploded. "You remembered that?" "I remember a lot of things I pretended not to notice," she said quietly. "I'm trying to pay attention now, really pay attention." Father Miguel arrived next, bringing warmth and the scent of pipe tobacco that clung to his jacket. He embraced us both, his presence somehow making the room feel safer, more sacred. Then my mother's car pulled into the driveway, and my stomach clenched. Maria looked different. She'd lost weight, too much weight, the kind that comes from stress rather than intention. Her hair was grayer than I remembered, pulled back without the careful styling she'd always maintained. She wore minimal makeup, and her hands shook as she walked up the path carrying a small wrapped box. "Thank you for inviting me," she said at the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted, stepping back to let her in. Dinner started quietly, almost awkwardly. We passed dishes and made small talk about the weather, the holidays, anything except the elephant that took up half the room. Father Miguel blessed the food with a prayer that asked for healing and honest hearts. We made it through the main course. I was just bringing out dessert flan, my mother's recipe, when Maria's fork clattered against her plate, and she started crying. Not delicate tears, not performative sobs, real, ugly crying that came from somewhere deep and broken. "I'm so sorry," she gasped between breaths. "Angela, Isabel, I'm so sorry for everything." Isabel reached across the table and took her hand. I stood frozen with the flan still in my hands, unsure what to do. "Your father controlled everything," Maria continued, her voice thick with tears and decades of suppressed truth. "The money, our social life, who I could see, who I could talk to. I knew what he was doing was wrong. I knew he was destroying you both. But I felt so powerless." She looked up at me, her eyes red and raw. "I should have been stronger. I should have protected you. I should have left him and taken you girls with me. But I was scared. I was weak. And you paid the price for my weakness." She pulled a tissue from her purse, wiping her face with shaking hands. "I've left him. I'm living with my sister now. I'm going to therapy twice a week. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I just need you to know that I see what I did, what I didn't do, and I'm sorry." The apology was so different from anything Carlos had ever offered. There was no deflection, no justification, no attempt to make herself the victim. Just raw acknowledgement of failure and harm. I set the flan down carefully and sat back in my chair. "You were a victim too, Mom, but you were also complicit. You chose to stay. You chose silence over protecting your daughters." "I know," she whispered. "But—" I continued, my voice softening slightly. "I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you left. This is a start. But rebuilding trust, if that's even possible, is going to take a long time. Years, maybe. And it requires you to keep doing the work. Not just therapy, but real change, real honesty." "I understand," Maria said. "I don't expect anything from you, just the chance to try." The evening continued, the tension gradually easing into something that felt almost like family. Isabel talked about starting community college classes in business administration. Maria shared stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard before, stories that made Rosa come alive in ways I'd never experienced. Father Miguel spoke about forgiveness as a process, not an event, reminding us that healing doesn't mean forgetting. As Maria prepared to leave, I walked her to the door. "If you keep going to therapy, if you stay honest, we can try to build something new," I said. "Not the old family that's dead, but maybe something better, something real. But it requires work from you, Mom. Real work." She nodded, tears streaming down her face again. "Thank you for giving me a chance." After everyone left, Michael found me in the kitchen washing dishes. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "That was beautiful," he murmured. "Hard, but beautiful." "It's not forgiveness yet," I said. "Maybe it never will be. But it's a door left open instead of slammed shut." But Angela's journey wasn't just about confronting her past, it was about building a future that honored her mother's memory. The land my mother had left me sat on the edge of Phoenix, a 2-acre plot that had been mostly dirt and scrub brush when she bought it 15 years ago. Now the city had grown around it and property values had soared. I could have sold it for over $1 million. Instead, I broke ground on Rosa's place in February, 3 months after that quiet Christmas dinner. The architectural plans spread across my desk showed a single-story building designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. Large windows to let in natural light, a community room for group sessions, private offices for one-on-one counseling, a computer lab where women could take classes in financial literacy, resume writing, job searching, a legal aid office staffed by volunteer attorneys who could help with restraining orders, divorce proceedings, custody battles. "It's perfect," Isabel said, looking over my shoulder at the renderings. We'd been meeting twice a week to work on the center's marketing and outreach strategy. Working together had been awkward at first, both of us carrying the weight of our history. But gradually, something had shifted. We were learning to be sisters without the poisonous dynamic our parents had created. "Mom would have loved this," Isabel added softly. "That's the point," I said. "She wanted to help people but couldn't help herself. Now we can finish what she started." Michael contributed the technology infrastructure, a secure online platform where women could connect with mentors, access resources, attend virtual support groups from the safety of their homes. He built it himself, working late into the night, because, as he said, some things are too important to delegate. The local news picked up the story in March. I gave an interview standing in front of the construction site, dust and noise in the background, explaining why this mattered. "My mother Rosa couldn't escape her situation," I told the reporter, "but she dreamed of helping others who were trapped like she was. This center is her legacy continued. It's for women who need to hear that leaving toxic family situations isn't weakness, it's strength. That defining your own worth isn't selfish, it's survival." The interview ran that evening. By morning, we'd received 200 calls from women wanting to know when the center would open, and 50 volunteers offering their time. 3 months into construction, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing contractor invoices in my office, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Angela." The voice was my father's, but different. Stripped of bravado, of manipulation, of everything except exhaustion. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." My hand tightened around the phone. "How did you get this number?" "Your Aunt Carmen. I'm calling from a facility. Gamblers Anonymous residential program. Court-ordered after 3 creditors sued me." He paused, and I heard voices in the background, institutional sounds. "I don't expect you to forgive me. That's not why I'm calling." I said nothing, waiting. "My sponsor says I need to make amends by telling the truth, not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging harm." His breath came through the phone line, shaky. "Angela, I destroyed you to hide my own shame. Every time I stole from you, every time I sabotaged your future, every time I told you that you weren't good enough, it was because accepting that I was wrong would mean facing what I'd become. A gambler. An addict. A man who used his own children as shields for his addiction. I closed my eyes, listening to the father I'd never really known finally tell the truth. "You were never the problem," he continued, his voice breaking. "You were never inadequate or worthless or any of the things I made you believe. You were just there. And I needed someone to blame for my failures, someone to sacrifice so I could keep gambling, keep lying to myself." He was crying now. "I'm in treatment now, 60 days in. Not because I want something from you, not because I'm trying to manipulate you into helping me financially, but because I finally admitted that I need help, that I've needed help for 25 years. Silence stretched between us. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "That's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry for everything. You deserved a father who protected you, who celebrated you, who loved you. Instead, you got me. I'm sorry." The line went dead. He'd hung up before I could respond. I sat in my office for a long time, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to silence. I thought about calling back. I thought about screaming at him or forgiving him or telling him it was too little too late. Instead, I just sat there and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But something else. Closure, maybe. The sense that the story had finally reached an ending, even if it wasn't the ending anyone would have written. Michael found me there an hour later, still sitting with my phone in my hand. "He called," I said simply. Michael sat down across from me and waited. "From treatment, Gamblers Anonymous." He apologized. Really apologized, not the manipulative kind. Just acknowledged what he did and why. I set the phone down carefully. I don't know if he means it. I don't know if he'll relapse next month or next year. Addiction doesn't work on a timeline. "What do you want to do?" Michael asked. "Nothing," I said, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones. I don't need to call him back. I don't need to rebuild a relationship with him. I don't need to forgive him or hold on to anger. I just need to let it be what it is. A man finally admitting truth too late to fix what he broke, but early enough that maybe he can stop breaking new things. Michael nodded slowly. "That's healing too. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind." "Yeah," I agreed. "The scars are still there. They'll always be there, but they've stopped bleeding." And then Michael surprised Angela with a proposal that would test her capacity for mercy. Rosa's place held its soft opening in late June, 6 months after we'd broken ground. The building wasn't completely finished. We were still working on the outdoor space and finalizing some interior details, but the main facilities were ready. We invited a small group, the volunteers who'd donated their time, the women who'd already signed up for services, local community leaders, and Father Miguel, who blessed the building in a ceremony that made me cry. Isabel had worked herself nearly to exhaustion on the marketing campaign. Flyers, social media, partnerships with domestic violence shelters, and legal aid organizations. She'd approached the work with an intensity that reminded me of myself at 21, building my first company with something to prove. That evening, as the sun set and our small group gathered in the community room with wine and appetizers, I saw Michael pull Isabel aside near the windows overlooking the desert landscape. They talked quietly for several minutes, and I watched Isabel's face shift from confusion to surprise to something that looked like hope mixed with fear. When they rejoined the group, Isabel caught my eye across the room with an expression that asked, "Did you know about this?" I shook my head slightly. I had no idea what Michael had said to her. Later that night, after everyone had left and Michael and I were cleaning up paper plates and plastic cups, I asked him. "I offered your sister a job," he said, simply loading dishes into a trash bag. I stopped mid-reach for a wine glass. "You what?" "I'm funding a startup. Ethical marketing for tech companies, helping smaller firms build their brands without the predatory practices of bigger agencies." He tied off the trash bag and looked at me. "Isabel has an MBA. She has real skills. She's smart, creative, and she's been working her ass off on this center's campaign. She just never had a fair opportunity to prove herself without your family's dysfunction interfering." "Michael," I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. I offered her a junior analyst position, he continued. Entry level. Same salary as any other new hire. Same evaluation process. If she doesn't perform, she gets let go. No special treatment. He came over to where I was standing and took my hands. But Angela, I believe everyone deserves a second chance when they're genuinely trying to change. You gave me that chance when you looked past my family name and saw me. Now I want to pay that forward. My eyes filled with tears. She hurt me for 20 years. I know, and she spent the last 6 months trying to make amends, not with words, with actions. He squeezed my hands gently. This isn't about erasing what she did. It's about giving her the opportunity to become who she could have been without your parents destroying her. What did she say? She cried, asked why I would help her after how she treated you. I told her that success isn't about keeping people down, it's about lifting them up when they're ready to climb. He smiled slightly. Also told her that I needed a second chance once too when I left my family. Someone believed in me. Now it's my turn to believe in someone else. I wrapped my arms around him and pressed my face against his chest. You're a better person than I am. No, he said into my hair. I'm just further along in my healing. You'll get here too. Isabel started working for Michael's startup 2 weeks later. She never asked me if it was okay, never tried to use our relationship to gain advantage. She showed up on her first day early, stayed late, and worked like someone who understood that this opportunity was a gift she had to earn every single day. Over the following months, I heard about her progress through Michael's occasional updates. She was good at her job. Creative, hardworking, detail-oriented. Her co-workers had no idea she was the boss's sister-in-law. She'd asked Michael not to tell them wanting to succeed or fail on her own merit. 6 months into her position, Isabel called me on a Tuesday evening. I was at home reviewing applications for Rosa's Place Scholarship Fund when her name appeared on my screen. Hey, she said when I answered, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I got my first solo project today. Yeah. Small tech company needs complete rebranding. The client specifically requested me after seeing my work on another project. Angela, they requested me, by name, because they liked my work. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. That's amazing, Isabel. My manager called me into her office and told me the client praised my innovative approach and attention to detail. Her voice wavered slightly. And I realized something. For the first time in my life, I felt proud of myself. Not proud because I beat you at something. Not proud because Dad approved. Just proud because I did good work and someone noticed. Pride that's mine that I earned. That's what it feels like, I said softly, defining your own worth. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving me a chance to start over. Thank you for not writing me off. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I didn't do this, Isabel. You did. Michael gave you the opportunity, but you're the one showing up every day and doing the work. I'm proud of you, really proud. After we hung up, I sat in my office, smiling at nothing, feeling like maybe finally something good had come from all the pain our family had caused. Isabel was becoming the person she could have been all along, and I got to witness it. But the most emotional moment was still to come when a face from Michael's past arrived at the center's grand opening. The grand opening of Rosa's Place took place on a Saturday in September, exactly 1 year after that disastrous Christmas dinner at Marchetti's. The contrast wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I'd been sitting in a corner being humiliated, and now I stood in front of a building that bore my mother's name, surrounded by over 200 people who'd come to celebrate not just a facility, but a mission. Local news crews set up cameras. The mayor gave a speech about community support for vulnerable populations. Women who'd already benefited from our pre-opening services shared their stories, leaving abusive marriages, rebuilding credit destroyed by family members finding jobs after years of being told they were worthless. I was greeting guests near the entrance when I noticed her, a woman in her early 60s, distinguished in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or jewelry and everything to do with the confidence in her posture. She had dark hair streaked with silver pulled back in an elegant twist and wore a simple navy dress that looked both professional and comfortable. She carried an envelope in her hand. "Ms. Ramirez?" she asked, approaching me with a warm smile. "I'm Elena Martinez. I apologize for coming unannounced, but I wanted to present this in person." She handed me the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. I looked up at her stunned. "Ms. Martinez, this is incredibly generous. Thank you." "Please call me Elena." She gestured toward the building. "May we speak privately for a moment?" We walked to my office, a small room with windows overlooking the desert. Elena sat across from my desk and leaned forward slightly. "I want to fund your scholarship program," she said, "specifically for women over 40 who want to return to school but think it's too late to change their lives." "That's exactly what we're planning," I said. "How did you know?" "Because I was that woman 30 years ago." Elena's eyes held mine with an intensity that felt familiar somehow. "I left a marriage where I was controlled, isolated, told my only value was as an extension of my husband's success. I walked away at 45 with nothing but my education and determination. I rebuilt my entire life from scratch, started a consulting business, put myself through an MBA program while working full-time, proved to myself that I was more than the name I'd married into." As she spoke, I felt that same recognition I'd felt the first time I really talked with Michael, the sense of finding someone who understood. "Your story," Elena continued, "the way you built your company while being undermined by your family, the way you're channeling that pain into helping others, it resonated deeply with me. This center is exactly what I needed when I was escaping, and it didn't exist. I want to make sure it's here for women who need it now." We talked for 20 minutes about her vision for the scholarship program, about her own experiences, about the particular challenges women face when they try to change their lives after 40. She was brilliant, compassionate, and spoke about family dysfunction with the kind of insight that only comes from having lived through it. The office door opened and Michael walked in, stopping short when he saw Elena. Then his face transformed into pure joy. "Mom," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides and embracing her tightly. "You came." I stood up so fast my chair rolled backward. "Mom." Michael turned to me, one arm still around Elena, his expression almost sheepish. "Angela, I'd like you to meet someone very important to me. This is my mother, Elena Martinez." "Martinez," I repeated, the pieces clicking into place. "Not Rivera." "I changed it back to my maiden name 15 years ago," Elena explained, "when I divorced Michael's father and left the Rivera family completely. It was part of reclaiming my identity." She looked at Michael with obvious pride. "Michael has kept my existence private to protect me from his family, who would absolutely try to use me to get to him if they knew where I was or who I'd become." "She's the reason I understood what you went through," Michael said to me. "She survived something similar, a family that saw her as property rather than a person. When I met you and heard your story, I recognized it because I'd watched my mother fight the same battle." Elena took my hand. "When Michael told me about you and about Rosa's place, I knew I had to help. I see so much of myself in you, Angela. And I see so much of what I wish someone had offered me 30 years ago when I was terrified and alone and convinced it was too late to change my life." I felt tears prickling my eyes. "Thank you for the donation, for sharing your story, for understanding." "May I volunteer here?" Elena asked. "I'd like to mentor women who think they're too old to start over. I'm living proof that it's never too late." Elena became a fixture at Rosa's place over the following months. She came every Tuesday and Thursday meeting with women in their 40s, 50s, 60s who'd been told by family or society or their own internalized voices that their chance had passed. She shared her story, openly leaving wealth to gain freedom, rebuilding her identity at 45, learning that she was prouder of the woman she became than any name or status she'd left behind. I watched her work and saw 3 generations of healing happening simultaneously. Elena, who'd escaped and rebuilt. Me, who'd survived and created. And the young women who came to the center who were learning early what we'd learned late, that family doesn't define worth, that leaving toxic situations is strength, that there's no expiration date on building the life you deserve. One afternoon in November, Elena and I stood together watching a support group session through the window of the community room. She put her arm around my shoulders. "Your mother would be proud," she said quietly. "Rose's place is exactly what she dreamed of, a place where women can find the support she never had." "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything. For being Michael's mother. For understanding. For being here. Thank you for giving my son a family worth having," she replied. And as the year came to an end, Angela prepared to host a Christmas unlike any before. 1 year after that humiliating Christmas dinner at Marchetti's, I stood in the community room of Rosa's place, setting a table that looked nothing like the one from that nightmare. This table was long and simple, covered in a cheerful red cloth. Mismatched chairs surrounded it, some from donations, some we'd bought secondhand. White Christmas lights strung along the windows cast a warm glow across the desert landscape, visible through the glass. The menu was homemade turkey that Michael and I had spent all morning preparing, Elena's traditional Cuban black beans and rice, Isabel's surprisingly good sweet potato casserole and tamales that filled the building with the scent of masa and spices. The guest list was completely different too. Michael and Elena arrived first, carrying pies and a box of gifts for the women who'd be joining us. Isabel came next with her boyfriend David, a high school history teacher she'd met at a community education seminar. He was kind, soft-spoken, nothing like Brad's aggressive confidence. When he looked at Isabel, I saw genuine affection rather than calculation. Father Miguel arrived with his guitar, promising to play Christmas carols after dinner. 3 women from the center came: Jessica, who'd just signed her first lease on an apartment after leaving her controlling mother; Brenda, who'd escaped a 20-year abusive marriage and was now studying accounting; and Yolanda, a grandmother who was rebuilding her life after her family had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit. All 3 had nowhere else to go for Christmas, and when I'd invited them, they'd cried with gratitude. Then my Aunt Carmen arrived, followed by my cousins Jennifer and Marco and my Uncle Victor. These were relatives who'd sat at that table a year ago and said nothing when my family mocked Michael and me. But 3 weeks ago, handwritten letters had arrived at my office. Real letters on paper with actual handwriting. "I was complicit in your humiliation," Aunt Carmen had written. "I sat silent when I should have spoken up. I believed your father's version of events when I should have asked for yours. I'm deeply sorry, and I understand if you can't forgive me, but I want you to know I see the truth now." Similar words from Jennifer, Marco, and Uncle Victor. When I'd called to invite them to Christmas dinner, each had been shocked that I'd even consider it. But I'd learned something over the past year. Holding on to anger hurt me more than it hurt them. And these relatives had done something my father never did, admitted they were wrong and genuinely changed. They arrived bearing donations for Rose's place and genuine humility. No designer clothes, no show of wealth, just family members who wanted to make amends. The last person to arrive was my mother. Maria looked healthier than she had at our small dinner in my home. She'd gained back some weight, and though her face still showed the stress of the past year, there was something lighter in her eyes. She carried a large pot wrapped in towels to keep it warm. "Tamales," she said simply. "Rosa's recipe. I thought it might be appropriate." She'd been in therapy for 8 months now. She'd moved out of my aunt's house and into a small apartment of her own. She'd started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, using her experience to help other women recognize the patterns of control she'd lived with for decades. She wasn't divorced from Carlos, that was a complexity I'd learned to accept, but she was separated, living independently, doing the work. Dinner was nothing like last year. There were no careful seating arrangements designed to humiliate. No toasts that cut like knives. No performance for an audience. Just people passing dishes, sharing stories, laughing at Father Miguel's terrible jokes, enjoying each other's company because they genuinely wanted to be there. I watched my mother help Yolanda understand the paperwork for her credit repair, saw her face animated as she explained the process, heard her say, "I know how this feels, I've been through it." I saw glimpses of the woman she might have been if Carlos hadn't spent 30 years controlling her. After dinner, Maria found me in the kitchen washing dishes. She picked up a towel and started drying without asking. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become," she said quietly. "This place, what you're doing here, the family you've built, Rosa dreamed of this. Dreamed of helping women like herself. And you made it real." "Thank you," I said, not quite able to say more. "I'm proud too," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even if I have no right to be. Even if I don't deserve to feel proud after failing you so completely. I want you to know I see you now. I see what you overcame. And I'm proud." After everyone had left and Michael had driven Elena home, Isabel and I stood in the parking lot under the clear December sky. The temperature had dropped unusual for Phoenix, cold enough to see our breath. "Want to come with me somewhere?" I asked. She nodded without asking where. We drove to the cemetery in comfortable silence, Christmas music playing softly on the radio. I'd brought yellow roses, my mother's favorite. The cemetery was quiet, empty, most people home with their families. We found Rosa's headstone easily. We'd both visited enough times over the years to know the way by heart. Isabel and I sat down on the grass beside the grave, laying the roses against the cold marble. The headstone was simple: Rosa Maria Ramirez, beloved mother and friend, followed by her dates. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Isabel asked, her voice small in the darkness. I thought about my mother's video about the woman who'd tried to protect me but couldn't, about the strength she'd shown at the end of her life by leaving me truth and land and love in the only way she'd known how. "I think she always was proud," I said slowly. "She just couldn't show it the way she wanted to. Dad controlled so much of her life. But yeah, I think she always loved us both, even when she couldn't protect us." We sat in silence. But it wasn't the painful silence of our childhood, the silence of being ignored, of feeling invisible. This was the peaceful quiet of two people who'd found each other again after decades of being pitted against each other. Two sisters who'd survived the same war and come out on the other side. "We made it, Mama," I whispered to the cold stone. "We're both okay now. Isabel's got a good job, a good man, a chance to be who she was meant to be. I've got Michael and the company in Rosa's place. We're both okay." Light snow began to fall, rare for Phoenix, but not impossible. Soft flakes that melted almost as soon as they touched the ground. Isabel linked her arm through mine, and we sat there together, two women who'd transformed generational pain into strength, who'd created the family we deserved, rather than accepting the one we'd been given. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living the life they said you could never have, and doing it with grace, purpose, and the family you chose for yourself. And that's where Angela's story ends, or rather where her new beginning truly starts. From an invisible daughter dismissed by her own family to a successful CEO and founder of a center that helps women find their voice and rebuild their lives. From sitting in the corner of that Christmas dinner being humiliated to hosting a celebration surrounded by people who genuinely love and respect her. That's not just revenge. That's transformation. What strikes me most about Angela's journey isn't just that she succeeded despite her family's cruelty. It's that she chose grace over bitterness. She could have destroyed her parents publicly, could have refused to help Isabel, could have carried that anger for the rest of her life. Instead, she built something meaningful. She turned her pain into purpose. And in doing so, she didn't just save herself, she created a path for other women to follow. I know many of you watching this have your own stories of family rejection, of being underestimated, of fighting to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Maybe you've been the invisible child, or the one carrying impossible expectations. Maybe you've had to walk away from toxic family members, or you're still trying to find the courage to do so. If that's you, I want you to know Angela's story isn't fiction. It's a reflection of what's possible when you choose yourself. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had to walk away from family to protect yourself? Have you built success despite being told you'd fail? Or are you still in the middle of your own journey trying to figure out how to break free? Share your story in the comments below. This community is full of incredible, resilient people, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or validation or just a satisfying sense of justice, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We share stories like this every week, stories about courage, resilience, and people who refuse to let their past define their future. Your support helps us keep bringing these narratives to life. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Angela's story. And remember, the greatest revenge really is living well. Not for them, but for you.